Good deal. If we're all feeling good, let me do what I normally do and give you a little bit of a recap as to what we talked about yesterday, got into. We have now moved into the big boy and girl chapters. Okay, we kicked off agency, and boy howdy, did we hit the ground running. So we started having discussions on tiers of authority with agency. We started talking about a little bit of representation. We talked about some agency agreements. We started talking about obligations to clients and principals versus obligations to customers. We talked about those fiduciary duties. We have gotten into a lot, and we left off getting into some very specific disclosure pieces on how you can be in trouble in North Carolina if you fail to disclose certain things required by law. Before I start making you learn new stuff, let me just ask you some questions to recap what I threw at you yesterday. I told you when you were reading the test, especially reading any question on the test on the North Carolina side, and you see the word agent, where should your brain automatically go? The firm. The firm. And that's going to be even more important today as we get a little bit more in depth. And so let's say that Sandeep hires me and I work for Coldwell Banker. Well, he really hired Coldwell Banker. And what does that make me? A sub-agent of Coldwell Banker. And so what does that make every single other person within the firm? Sub-agent. That's exactly right. Now, I told you, yes, there can be sole proprietors being hired, and at that point, that changes the question in its entirety. If it's one person and one person only, it's a very different scenario than if you've got a whole brokerage firm. Now, understand you could have a brokerage firm with one person, a brokerage firm with two people, and a brokerage firm with 1,000 people. Same thing, you could have a sole proprietor acting independently as one person, a sole proprietorship that has an affiliated licensee, making it two people, and a sole proprietorship that has 1,000 people. So it's the one number that changes things, because if we're dealing with a multi-person sole proprietorship or firm, they probably are going to act very similarly, because that would mean that that sole proprietorship had to have a BIC and could do everything a firm could do. And we're going to get into that a little bit more as we go along. So the other things we got into were tiers of authority. Okay, who remembers? What were the tiers of authority? When you're an agent, you're representing somebody else. And what levels of power could you have within that relationship? Yeah, there you go. Universal and special. I heard you say, Monica. What was the last one, folks? General. Okay, so tell me about a universal agent. How much power do they have?
Personal and business.
Yeah, a lot, right?
Yeah. Universal has the most power.
There you go.
Absolutely.
There you go. Universal is unlimited power. They can do anything and everything on behalf of you. Not very common in the real estate world. What about the next tier down? General. What can you do as a general agent? No, wait, not everybody at once. Please, calm down. You're too loud.
Property management?
Property management would be a prime example of it, but what makes you a general agent? What do you have the ability to do?
Okay, then negotiate?
Negotiate, yeah, but there's a little bit more.
Enter into contracts for the principal.
There you go. You can actually bind your principal to very specific things. Not anything, but you've been given very specific authority to bind them to certain things. Property management is an example, because as a property manager, you typically have the ability to sign leases on their behalf, to order repairs and pay those repairs on their behalf, to start eviction proceedings on their behalf. If we're dealing with a general agent, what was the other example I gave you?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. What was the other example of a general agent level of authority that I gave you that exists in the real estate world?
A real estate to their firm.
There you go. A real estate licensee to their affiliated firm, because they sign the independent contractors agreement. And remember, it is the individual licensee who is typically signing that agency contract, even though it's in the name of the firm, which means we have been given the authority to bind them to that agency contract. And then what was the lowest tier of authority in those agency powers? Special, right? You are the 007 of real estate, okay? You just kick in the door, go, and then you flash your little pocket card that shows your license, and you just feel special, don't you? That's the most common when you are working with buyers and sellers. And what can you do?
Advice?
Advice. Advice. Yeah. You can't bind them to anything. You don't have that power. You say, well, here's an offer. Here's what I think. What do you want to do, right? They're the decision makers. You do not have the authority to make decisions on their behalf. Now, could you be given certain limited things to sign something with their permission, with a power of attorney? Sure. But in general, we are special agents. We can't sign anything for them. It's their decision to make in that regard. So then we started talking about some of the other words that you're going to hear for agency, and we'll get a little more into them. But when I say listing agent, whom do you represent?
The seller.
The seller. When I say seller's agent, whom do you represent?
The seller.
The seller. When I say selling agent, whom do you represent?
The buyer.
Unknown.
Unknown. We don't know. Selling just means you brought a buyer. You are currently assisting a buyer. But it is never a strong enough word to dictate loyalties. What other words would we look for to trigger whether we are or are not representing that person?
Client, customer.
Client versus customer. If you were the selling agent working with a client, that's your person. If you're the selling agent working with a buyer customer, that's not your person. And so if the buyer is not your person, who is the only other person you can have in North Carolina? Seller. There you go. There you go. So buyer's agent works for the buyer. Selling agent, we don't know, right? We would need more details. It just means you brought the buyer. And when that really comes into play is when we talk about commissions, right? There's the listing commission and there's the selling commission. The selling commission gets paid to the person who brought the buyer. That person could be a seller sub-agent or a buyer's agent. But either way, they're getting paid because they brought the buyer. We're going to give some more examples of that today. So we talked about agency agreements and how they end. What were some of the ways that an agency contract can end?
Mutual agreement.
Mutual agreement will kill every single contract, including those. Absolutely.
Fulfillment of the term.
Fulfillment. Sure, right? You hired me to help you sell your house. I sold it. You paid me. We're donesies, right? Same thing with a buyer, same thing, whatever. Fulfillment of purpose. We did our job.
Breach of party.
Breach of the party. That's exactly right. You can never just get out because I don't like you no more. I don't like your face or nothing. That's not a breach. But if I made promises to you or you to me, and one of us fails on those promises, we could potentially get out. When somebody breaches, it typically gives the non-breaching party a right to get out of it. But don't confuse that with without penalties. There's typically penalties when you breach. And we're going to see that today when we get into these agency contracts a little bit more. What else would kill an agency contract?
Expiration of terms.
Expiration. There you go. I told you in North Carolina and most states actually, you have to have a very definitive expiration date on these agency contracts. And so when that date hits, it's donesies, right? What else?
Possibly by death of the client.
Say it again, Dora.
Possibly by death of your client.
What do you mean possibly?
Well, we said if it was, oh goodness, like if there were in the middle of like a purchasing,
Sure. Sales contracts do not die with death, but you're absolutely right. Agency contracts do. So death of a party would kill an agency contract. So if you have a listing agreement and the seller dies, the agency contract, the listing agreement is dead. If you have a buyer agency agreement and the buyer dies, the buyer agency agreement is dead. But what was the word of caution on the other party? Us. Who would have to die?
Firm.
The whole firm, unless
You're a sole proprietor.
Unless you're a sole proprietorship. Because if we hire Coldwell Banker and one affiliated licensee dies, the agency agreement is alive and well because Coldwell Banker is still alive and Coldwell Banker was the agent. If the firm dissolved, if the firm went bankrupt, if the firm, lost its BIC, its qualifying broker, whatever, then that would kill it. But otherwise, one licensee doesn't, unless it's a sole proprietorship. So the last one was destruction of the property, and destruction of the property only applied to which agency contracts?
The listing?
And?
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 I must have missed that.
Well, think about it. Is there another one that is property specific?
Oh, the agency agreement?
Well, agency agreement is just a general terminology for all of these.
For the closing contract, right? Like I'm thinking the right thing. Or like the contract that's the agreement to buy. That's called the closing contract, or what's that called again?
The sales contract.
Okay, then the sales contract.
Nope, not the sales contract. We'll get into that a little bit more in a later section, but there's an agency contract that would die with destruction of the property.
Are we a proper, like the rental agreement?
Yeah, you were about to say it. Property management agreements.
Management, yeah.
Dora hires me to manage her 80-unit apartment complex. If the 80-unit apartment complex burns down, I ain't got nothing to manage no more. If, anything that's property specific, that would die with destruction of the property. But a buyer agency agreement wouldn't because it is not property specific. So we're going to get into agency contracts a little bit more today and talk about the specifics behind each one from a testable light. And of course, dive into agency a lot more. But let's pick back up where we left off now, okay? We got into material facts. And what's a material fact?
Anything that could adjust the buyer's perspective on whether or not they want to buy a property.
Be very careful about just using the word buyer. That would be an example, but it's anything that could change the outlook of any party in North Carolina is the way we look at it to complete the transaction. Buyer, seller, lessor, lessee, doesn't matter. If it's something that could change the outlook of a party's completing the transaction, it's a material fact, we'd have to disclose it. So, for instance, if, we talked about kind of like financing being one of those things. If I was a seller and you had a buyer and your buyer was trying to pay with a bag of pennies, you probably should tell me that, right? Because even if it's, $300,000 worth of pennies, I'm probably gonna be like, no. So anything, that's kind of an abstract way of articulating it, but anything that could change the outlook of a party in completing the transaction. And so North Carolina, this is written into our license laws, and it exists to an extent in every state, but of course we get a little more specific in our state on the do's, the don'ts, the can'ts, the won'ts. And so what were the categories at minimum that we say that we utilize or consider material facts? What were the 4 categories?
The property itself,
Facts about the property itself.
facts relating directly to use the property,
Facts relating directly to the property.
Facts known to be of specific importance to.
Anything known to be of special or specific importance to a party. Once they say this is important to me, it becomes a material fact. And what was the last one?
facts relating directly to the ability of the agent's principal to complete the transaction.
There you go.
Finance.
There you go. And so those can run the gambit. And so these are always things that, I'm going to say this, that we as licensees have to disclose. And in fact, there is a duty in North Carolina to discover and disclose. We can't play stupid. That means that if we go to a seller's house and we see water damage, we got to ask questions, right? What's that from? Is your roof leaking? Well, when was the last time you had it checked? Was it repaired? Do you have invoices? So discover and disclose. We're going to get into it a little bit more in a second, but I'm telling you, North Carolina, sellers don't have really any disclosure obligations. I'm not going to say none, but really none, more or less. So here's where we left off. The way that you get in trouble as a licensee with material facts is failing to disclose them or lying about them. Not disclosing is called an omission. Lying is called a misrepresentation. And either of those could be done willfully, meaning intentionally, or in negligence, meaning you didn't do your job right. You should have known, but you didn't. You didn't do your research. You relied on unreliable information, whatever you want to call it, okay? So it's possible to have a willful misrepresentation, a negligent misrepresentation. It's possible to have a willful omission. It's possible to have a negligent omission. And the best way to tackle these on the test is to take it piece by piece. First, decide, was it willful or negligence? There are words: knew, was aware, was told, read, saw. Something like that's going to tell you willful. Didn't check, didn't investigate, didn't research, didn't know, pulled from unreliable sources. It's going to be negligence. And then you're going to flip it around. Okay, did they say something untrue? That's a misrepresentation. Did they say nothing when they had an obligation to? That's an omission. There you go. So let's just give you a couple examples here. Licensee for willful misrepresentation. The licensee had actual knowledge of a material fact and deliberately misinforms the buyer, seller, tenant, landlord, whoever concerning such a fact. Folks, it doesn't matter who they told it, because we owe material facts to who?
Everybody.
Everybody in the club getting tipsy. ERRRRY body. Okay? Everybody gets material facts disclosure. So it doesn't matter if you did or didn't represent them. It doesn't matter. So that is a willful misrepresentation. So here's an example for you. Agent knows that the heat pump at a listed house does not function properly, but tells a customer or a client that all mechanical systems are in good condition. This agent would be guilty of a willful misrepresentation. They knew it was not working and they lied and said it did. Let's look at the next one. Negligent misrepresentation is when you unintentionally misinform a customer or a client, doesn't matter, concerning a material fact because you didn't know, you had incorrect information, or made a mistake. Now, folks, this is where in the real world, if you don't know something, don't just lie, right? A buyer looks at you, oh, would this be able to sustain a septic? Oh, yeah, I'm sure it would. Yeah, definitely would. No problem. You don't say stuff like that. You don't just guess that the AC is working fine without verifying it. So if you make statements without verifying them, without knowing them, you are guilty of a negligent misrepresentation. So here's an example for you. Listing agent records incorrect information in the multiple listing service. Buyer's representative provides the MLS sheet to the prospective buyer. The listing agent would be guilty of a negligent misrepresentation. Understand that no matter which way you slice it, you're in trouble. It's just they like to identify, was it willful or was it negligent? I don't know that you're any more or less in trouble, but you're in trouble either way. So remember, be very careful on the test. If they say something as arbitrary as no, and it's untrue, it's still a misrepresentation, okay? A lot of people get caught up on that and they think, oh no, they didn't tell you, so it's an omission. No. If words, statements, or otherwise occurred, it was a misrepresentation. Omission can't occur if they say something. Or an omission can only occur if they say nothing. Everybody good with that statement? So a willful omission. Now we're talking about an intentional leaving something out. Okay, licensee has actual knowledge of a material fact and a duty to disclose that under these laws, but deliberately fails to disclose. They know about something and they don't tell you nothing. That's a problem. So give you an example here. Agent knows a zoning change, highway, etc., that would significantly enhance or adversely affect the value, or knows of a zoning change, should I say, but fails to disclose that to the buyer. They know, which makes it willful. They fail to disclose, which makes it an omission. Willful omission. And then the last iteration here is the negligent omission, okay? The licensee doesn't have actual knowledge of a problem, but there is something that they should have looked up and they didn't. So they don't have knowledge, but they reasonably should have known. It should have been within their wheelhouse. They should have been something they discovered, but they didn't. And so they didn't know, but they should have, and they left it out. So if a seller informs the listing agent of a roof leak and the listing agent actually forgets and fails to disclose, they were negligent in their duties and they omitted it even though it's something that should have been relayed. Now there's a lot of different ways that this could occur. A big highway coming through. If you don't know about a big highway coming through in the area as a real estate professional in the area that you live in, that would be negligence. It would have been your job to know that. And so you didn't know and you failed to disclose, that'd be a negligent omission. Now, there's another terminology that comes into play here, and it is called puffing. Not the kind that Snoop Dogg does with his boys, okay? Puffing is something a little bit different. Puffing is an exaggeration in marketing. Real estate agents do it all the time. Puffing is prettiest view of the beach, best home on the golf course, cozy when it's actually tiny, lots of potential when it's actually a garbage house. You see what I'm saying? Puffing is making it sound really good, and subjectively it could be true to somebody. However, it can get you in trouble if you're looking at that gas station and you say prettiest view on the island. That's not the prettiest view on the island. So there's a certain line that it could cross where it would just be a misrepresentation. But prettiest view of the ocean, if it's actually got a pretty view, it's okay. Just be careful.
Seth, is puffing always associated with advertising?
Yeah, have you heard it in a different context?
No, I was asking a question.
Okay, yes. I just wanted to make sure that, there wasn't like something that I needed to address, like a specific thing that you heard. But yeah, puffing is just an exaggeration in marketing. And what Snoop Dogg does. Puff, puff, pass. All that good stuff. Whatever. So let's give you an example here of one of these scenarios, and you tell me what you got here. Okay, we got a homeowner assures their broker that the 20-year-old HVAC system performs properly, yet each time the broker shows the home, the temperature is 80 degrees and the compressor is heavily rusted. The broker proceeds to tell the buyer the unit performs properly. However, after closing, buyer determines it needs a $1,200 repair to cool the house below 80 on a warm day. The agent would be guilty of
Willful misrepresentation.
Yep.
It is definitely a misrepresentation. And this is one of those where it's kind of a slippery slope. They have reason to probably believe that it's not working properly. But is that a sure thing? Do they know without a doubt that it's not working properly?
No, the homeowner willfully misrepresented the information to their broker.
The homeowner did, and so what we've got to decide is what the broker did. And so they relied on unreliable information of it working. They did not verify whether it did or did not, but they made a statement that it worked either way.
Was he negligent?
This is negligent. They accepted something as truth when there was reason to believe that it wasn't true, but they never verified one way or another. They hopefully will not give you too many that are like really slippery slopes, but if you read some of them in the back of the License on Commission rule book, you got to be very careful with that line where they go from negligent to, willful. You probably know, but it's not assured that you know. There is nothing here to indicate that it's not true. Just suspicions. So negligence, they didn't verify, but then they still spoke it as truth. So just make sure you read these very carefully. Now, I told you yesterday when I introduced the License Law and Commission Rule Book that there are several prohibited acts under 93A-6A where you're going to be tested on them. And so number one was this one, dealing with material facts. And we're going to talk a little bit more about these when we get into the actual license on commission rulebook section again later, kind of towards the end of class. But there's another one that comes into play that deals with, went too far. This one. Okay, let's start here. Making false promises. So North Carolina license laws dictate that you can't make any promises to somebody to try to induce them to do something, or false promises in general. Like, oh, I promise I'll, buy you a replacement refrigerator, and then never do it. Oh, I promise that I'll have the house painted before, like this happens, and never do it. Oh, I promise I'll, make sure that they give you a credit at closing. False promises are prohibited, okay? Not allowed to make any false promises. Now, I don't have it pulled up, but I'll show you really quick just so you can see it, because I would suggest that you definitely consider this one section a study section. And more than anything, in regard to the license law and commission rulebook, the comments section is going to be the most pertinent for study purposes. But if you go back to the publications, license law and commission rules.
Page 106.
Yeah, that's the comment section, but I was just going to show you the actual place that the rule is located. Because remember, 106 just refers back to these rules with a little more detail and some examples. So here's the section that we're talking about, this disciplinary actions by commission, 93A-6. There's that misrepresentations and omission one. Number 2, making any false promises of a character likely to influence, persuade, or induce. Number 3, pursuing a course of misrepresentations or making of false promises through agents, advertising, or otherwise. So there's a big list of these. Now, they're not all testable, where you need to memorize these inside and out, but you could see some of these, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them later. I just want you to know where they kind of live. So then the next one, same thing from that list. Number 8 on that list, and I'll actually pull it back up real quick and show it to you because I didn't read you number 8, and that's a big one. Remember when I told you that in old car, you've got the expectation of reasonable skill and care? Well, that goes under the common law of agency, just in general. But very specifically in North Carolina license law, if you look at 8, in the same list of prohibited acts, being unworthy or incompetent to act as a real estate broker in a manner as to endanger the interest of the public. So, in other words, if you're an idiot, you are subject to disciplinary action by the commission. If you don't protect your client, if you don't do anything, that you're supposed to. Now, please understand that these laws are very ambiguous. They're very ambiguous. Who in here knows exactly what I mean when I say being unworthy or incompetent? How do we define that? So that's what the comment section is. It's basically where they give you some insight. So if you look down at the comment section for that one, well, it says, well, if you use the wrong contract, you're probably unworthy and incompetent. If you fill out the contract wrong, you're probably unworthy and incompetent. So it gives you some different examples of what may constitute this, but it's not an absolute. So failure to properly fill in the blanks of a real estate contract is an example there for that one. Next one is any improper, fraudulent, or dishonest dealing, taking advantage of the public, lying, being deceitful. All of that would be a no-go that would get us in trouble. Now, there's just a few more. We're not going to hit all of them right now, but there's a few more, and so I'm going to give you some insight into a couple of different things. As I always like to call them, mini lessons, right? M-I-N-I, mini. Smaller doses of maybe a full truth that you'll get later. So this next one says disclosure to principal of compensation from a vendor. I'm going to read it to you and then I'm going to clarify. It says licensees are prohibited from receiving any form of valuable consideration from a vendor or supplier of goods without first obtaining written consent of the principal. So I want to point out something here because this is going to appear in your curriculum later. There is something that is national legislation called RESPA. RESPA. It stands for the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act. Okay, RESPA, Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act. And so we're going to talk more in detail about this later in the financing legislation section, but I'll give you the quick rundown. The reason it exists is so that people are given disclosures to understand the true cost of buying a piece of real estate. Because if I said you're purchasing a $600,000 house with a 20% down payment over 30 years at a 6.2% interest rate, you have no idea what that actually is going to cost you. And so you have to be given a disclosure to help you understand the true cost. All the closing costs, your down payments, your monthly charges, your interest rates, your pity payment. We'll get more into that later. The reason why I'm bringing this up now is because this rule basically states that we can't collect money from somebody other than our client without informing them and getting consent from our client. However, please note that we can never accept money from anybody, even if our client says it's okay, if it is a violation of RESPA. And so let me give you an example. RESPA, the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, says that we as real estate brokers cannot give or receive kickbacks from any what we call settlement service providers. So we couldn't get money back from the closing attorney for sending them business. That'd be a violation of RESPA. We couldn't get money back from the lender. That'd be a violation of RESPA. The surveyor, the title insurance company, all these different pieces. So don't get confused, between these two different laws. North Carolina license law says you can't get kickbacks from anybody unless you have permission from your client, but they can never violate RESPA. So in this perfect example right here, it says property manager receives a kickback from a cleaning company for every unit cleaned. That's fine. There's no settlement. You're not buying anything. So if you have a cleaning company come in and clean 100 units and they give you $10 back per unit and cut you a check, you can accept that so long as you disclose it in writing to your client, the property owner. Everybody okay with that statement? So,
Does this violate the RESPA or no?
This does not, no. Because it has nothing to do with settlement. When I say settlement, it's buying a house, right? Settlement as in closing on a piece of property. This is not a settlement service provider, so that's okay. There's no violation here.
Okay.
So this kind of goes hand in hand with that disclosure to party of compensation for recommending services. This basically just says that, same thing, we can't collect any, instead of just like direct kickbacks from sending them business, any kind of referral fees or, anything from these third-party vendors without disclosing it to our clients. Same vein there. You don't need to group them separately. It's same thing. If I recommended a, home warranty company and they're going to give me a discount on my services because of this or, something like that. Same thing. You can never violate RESPA. But otherwise, North Carolina law just says you can accept it as long as your client says it's okay in writing and as long as it doesn't violate RESPA. That's what it comes down to in North Carolina. Now, with this same kind of topic, the Real Estate Commission has clearly stated that things of what they deem as nominal value are not subject to disclosure. The way that the commission defines nominal value is a $25 bottle of wine or a $50 gift card. So if you get that from a service provider or, somebody for a showing or something like that, that is not required to have written consent to receive that. Quite literally, when you look at the comments, it says, it doesn't say 25 to 50, it says it says like a $25 bottle of wine or a $50 gift card. That's what it says. So we just kind of blanket it here as like 25 to 50 bucks is nominal.
So forgive me because I am coming in here a little bit late, but just
how dare you, Josh?
I know.
What you got?
It's the life of a working man.
Struggle is real, ain't it?
So I heard a little bit, and I have a little bit of understanding that we're not supposed to accept kickbacks, which my understanding is just like a payment as a gratitude payment. Like, thank you for your services. Is that what that is? Well, I'm sorry, for recommendations. Excuse me, for
Yeah, for referrals, and so I'll repeat it. You can collect kickbacks or rebates from people. So in general, in North Carolina, so long as you disclose that to your client in writing, so they're aware of that kickback or that referral fee. But the rule is you can never accept one, even with your client's consent, if it is a violation of RESPA, the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act. So if I was to send you, Josh, let's say you're my buyer client, and I send you to my favorite closing attorney, and my favorite closing attorney is going to send me $100 for sending them you, that's a big violation of a piece of financing legislation called RESPA. So that's never going to be okay, even if the client says it is. It's not. So the way the rules, it works is you can accept it as long as your client says it's okay, and as long as it's not a violation of RESPA.
So basically, it has to be given to me from the client. It cannot be from a third party.
No, you can get paid from a third party. So the example we just used on the previous slide was if I was a property manager and I used a cleaning company to clean all the units when we turned them over, and they started giving me like a $10 a unit rebate on all the units, and then cut me like a $100 check every single time they do like the 10th unit. As long as I disclose it to the property owner, that's okay. That I got that kickback or that rebate from the cleaning company, but I would have to tell the person who owns the properties that in writing.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's keep talking about a few more rules. These are very specific to North Carolina. Other states have similar ones, so these are all going to show up more specifically on your North Carolina portion of your test. So there's what we call the delivery of instruments rule, and there's a couple different versions or iterations of the rule depending, but you can basically think of it as a blanketed thing. And so when I say instruments, folks, I don't mean xylophones. I mean documents. Okay, we call them instruments. And so you have to deliver all instruments, documents, to the appropriate party immediately, but in no case later than 3 days. So let me give you a couple examples here. If I'm a listing agent and I get an offer from a buyer's agent, I have to deliver that offer to my seller immediately, but in no case later than 3 days. If I'm a buyer's agent and I get a buyer agency agreement signed with a buyer, I would need to give that to my firm, that agency agreement, immediately in no case later than 3 days. If my sellers give me a counteroffer, right? It doesn't matter who the parties are. Any documents that need to go to somebody else or that somebody else is a party to, we give them a copy of it or deliver it immediately in no case later than 3 days. True of our clients, true of our firm, true of everything. Okay. Delivery of instruments rule. Immediately, but in no case later than 3 days. Now, in just a second, we're going to switch gears and talk about some more in-depth stuff. But before then, let me just kind of paint a picture for you. We're talking about these things that you have this obligation to do under license law and commission rules. Folks, if you violate these laws and rules, you are, amongst other things, subject to disciplinary action by the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. And so here is an introduction. I read it just a minute ago when we looked at 93A-6. It says the Real Estate Commission has the power to blank, blank, blank. So it is very testable to understand what the North Carolina Real Estate Commission can do to licensees. I want you to think of it this way. The Real Estate Commission giveth, the Real Estate Commission taketh away. They are the enforcing body who grants licensure. They can also take it away. So when we ask what the Real Estate Commission can do to a licensee, they can suspend your license. They can revoke your license. They can put limitations on your license. They can reprimand you, which is a formal disapproval that goes in your record. They can require additional education. So they can do a lot of different things to your license. But it's important to note, folks, this is very testable, that the North Carolina Real Estate Commission will never issue fines against a licensee. Never. But that doesn't mean that you won't be sued by the person that you did dirty. So that's what the second line is. Civil action brought by injured party. If you screw up, could your client sue you for your screw up? Yes. The commission's not going after you for money, but that doesn't mean somebody else isn't. Of course, if you do anything bad enough, like embezzling or breaking other laws, you could be subject to criminal prosecution for those things. Now, this last note says principal may also face civil liability due to agent's misconduct, potentially. If we give them bad advice, they follow it, and they are guilty of wrongdoing as well, but they could probably go after us also.
So if they're not gonna charge you or fine you, then what would be the disciplinary action?
Who, the commission?
Yeah.
I just told you. Take your license. Suspend your license. Revoke your license.
I didn't get that.
Yeah. So when I say limitations, they could say, well, we'll let you keep your license, but you can't be a BIC for 10 years. Or they could say, we'll let you keep your license, but you can't do property management anymore. They could say, we're going to take your license for 2 years. We're going to give your license, there's a lot of things they can do to your license, but they're not going to fine you. That's not how they do that in North Carolina. So here's where we're going to switch gears, and we're going to go back to agency, okay? I've already given you some pretty good insight, so I think this is going to go a lot easier than the average class. So let me throw some things up on the screen, okay? So on this list, you see single agency, buyer agency, sub-agency, dual agency, and agency and property management. Well, you've already understand buyer agency and seller agency. Now, seller's not on here, but seller is equally important in this mix. It just doesn't happen to be on this individual one. So I want you to understand something. If I say buyer agency, for all intents and purposes, that is single agency. Because if you are a buyer agent, I said this yesterday, who is the only person you care about?
The buyer.
The buyer. If I say seller agency, you can think single agency, because for all intents and purposes, right, who is the only person you care about?
The seller.
The seller. Now, folks, if you are representing the buyer and the seller, we can't call that buyer agency or seller agency. At that point, it evolves. It has changed. We call it dual. Just the word in and of itself, buyer agency, says you only care about the buyer. Seller agency is you only care about the seller. Now, I want you to think about something. I'm going to ask you a question. Do you think there might be real estate brokerage firms that exist out there that only represent buyers? Probably. So if we had a brokerage firm that only represents buyers, dual agency will never occur. Because if we can only represent buyers, it'd be impossible to represent a seller. Now, don't confuse that with we wouldn't be talking to or working with a seller. But if a firm that only works with buyers was talking to a seller, that seller would be a what?
Customer.
A customer. More specifically, a for sale by owner. Now, let me just paint this a little bit further, okay? Let's say ABC Realty only works with buyers. So that means if we are talking to the seller directly, we probably are talking to them as a for sale by owner, because otherwise we're probably going to go through the seller's what?
Listing agent.
Listing agent. So we'll probably never talk to that seller directly. Is this making sense for everybody? On the other side, do you think there might be firms that only represent sellers? Probably. And so that means dual agency would never arise. And so if a firm that only works with sellers is ever talking to or working with or assisting a buyer, that buyer is a what?
Customer.
A customer. Y'all see how that works? So when we say single agency, it's really the way the commission likes to look at it is, a firm that only works with buyers or a firm that only works with sellers, because then they will only ever be doing single agency. Now, the thing is, most brokerage firms work with both. Most do. And so when we get into working in a relationship with a buyer, but our firm also has a relationship with a seller, this is where things get a little more gray, a little more iffy. This is where dual agency comes into play. So I'm going to circle back around to dual agency, but I want to just kind of give you the visual of what I'm talking about. All right. When I say buyer agency, we are forming a relationship with the buyer. And the way that we form that relationship is with a buyer agency agreement. Now we're going to get into the agreements more in depth, but I'm going to explain something to you. I told you in North Carolina, all agreements for agency have to be express. What does that word express mean?
Verbalized.
Stated. There you go. We've got to state it. And so I'm going to make a very powerful, very testable statement here. In North Carolina, all agency agreements ultimately have to be in writing. You cannot go to closing with an oral agreement. However, we do allow oral buyer agency agreements to start with in North Carolina. But it is express. It still has to be stated. How is this going to flow? What does this look like? How is it, what it is, what it isn't. So an oral buyer agency agreement in North Carolina is always, aside from express, it's two other things. It is, here's that word Jacob kept looking for the other day, non-exclusive. And it is open-ended. There is no period of time associated with an oral buyer agency agreement. And you cannot bind somebody to work with only you under an oral buyer agency agreement. Let me explain why this exists. Folks, I want you to picture that you go on a blind date and you're meeting somebody for the first time. And within the first 10 minutes of meeting them, they look at you and they say, "Oh my God, I really think we should get married." What do you think? That sound like a good idea? Somebody you met 10 minutes ago? Y'all aren't nearly as shocked about this as you should be. Like some of you are like, "Yeah, I might consider it. Depends. Is it a good look? I don't know. Does he have a lot of money?" Folks.
That's a real TV show. It is.
Say what? Is it a real TV show? Mm-hmm. Oh my God. Yeah, no. Okay, so here's the point. Folks, I want you to think about this from now a real estate agent point of view. When you decide you want to buy a house and you call up an agent and you want to go see a house, in North Carolina, we can't show you a house without having a relationship with somebody. And I told you before, we either have to represent the buyer or the seller or both. And so if we're not representing the seller, then who do we need to represent? You, the buyer. And so if you were to show up and meeting an agent for the first time, and they pull out a 6-page document and they put it in your face and they say, this right here, this is the buyer agency agreement. It's 6 pages. I need you to sign it, and it means you're stuck with me for the next 3 months. Sign right here. You think most people are comfortable with that?
No, because you need to read it.
Well, you need to read it, but you know what? We might not want to work together. What if the agent's an idiot? So you can enter into an oral buyer agency agreement in North Carolina, but it is express. You would still state that, we're going to be working together, that you are technically my client. You can cancel any time. And if you wanted to get under contract, we cannot do that with an oral buyer agency agreement. It would have to be reduced to writing prior to us making an offer on your behalf. That's exactly right, Jacob. It's a trial period, right? It's dating is what it is. It is an opportunity to date, to see if we have any chemistry before we make it Facebook official, to use this dating analogy that we're running with here. But folks, just like dating, okay, I want you to think about it. If you go on a dating app and you find somebody tonight, you could go on 1 date with them and then you could ghost them. You could go on 17 dates with them and you could ghost them. You could go on, whatever. Same thing with oral buyer agency agreements. Kirsten says, "Why would you do this? Wouldn't you be putting yourself at risk?" You mean as a real estate agent? Yeah. But if I shove an agreement in your face and say, sign this now, I'm not working with you, you're probably more likely to not agree to that than you are to, you know? So there's no requirement for this to happen. We don't have to do this. But if somebody's iffy about signing something, we can enter into this agreement. And so we can't show you a house, legally speaking, in North Carolina, unless we have a relationship with somebody. So it's either we're representing the seller, you sign a written buyer agency agreement, or you give us this. These are options. Everybody still following along with me so far? I'm going to give you some deeper rooted examples of this in just a moment as we kind of unfold the layers here. By the way, folks, I have been teaching this for many, many years, and so I have to tell y'all something funny just because you probably haven't pieced it together, because I've gotten very strategic about the way I teach it. But as you might imagine, as a newer instructor many years ago when I'm teaching this concept to people, I found myself making a very egregious mistake when I taught this. You ready? I would use the dating analogy, and then I would talk about how you could have an oral agency agreement with multiple brokers at the same time. But instead of saying that, I said, well, it's like dating. You can have oral with this person, you can have oral with this person, you can have oral with this person. I'm like, wait a second, that's not what I meant. And it sounds way worse than I intended it to. So you have to say oral buyer agency agreements. Because if you just use a dating analogy and say that, it sounds terrible. But I've mastered it over the years. So I just tell you because it's funny, but I don't do it by accident anymore. So, there you go.
Very 70-ish.
Very what?
70-ish.
Yeah, there you go. So, when I say buyer agency, okay, you either have a relationship with somebody by way of an oral buyer agency agreement or a written buyer agency agreement, and that means the buyer is your person. What that means is you are going for blood against the seller. Now, understand one of two things, folks. Please understand that if you are a buyer's agent, the seller is not automatically unrepresented. It's just that we don't care about them, right? Because they could be a customer, or, well, let me rephrase that. They're a customer either way, but they could be a for sale by owner, meaning they don't have an agent, or they could be represented by somebody else. Either way, we don't care, do we? We just know they're not our person. Does that make sense? So if I say buyer agency, you care about the buyer. We don't really care about the seller in any way, shape, and form. They're a customer no matter which way you slice it. It could be an unrepresented customer, could be a customer represented by somebody else, but they're not my person. So that makes them a customer. So the beautiful thing about, single agency for buyers, there's never a conflict of interest. Never a conflict of interest. You only care about one party and you want to get them the best possible outcome. You agree?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I told you oral buyer agency agreements are an option. Here's a little more information on it. Now, we're going to get into this in just a second, but there is a very important piece that comes before you ever create a relationship with somebody. So we're kind of putting the cart before the horse here, but I want you to understand the relationships and then how we end up ultimately getting into them. We have the agency disclosure. And in North Carolina, we call it the Working with Real Estate Agents Disclosure, or the WWREA for short. And so that WWREA explains the relationships that you can form and how it goes working with a real estate agent. The reason being is you probably didn't realize to the umpteenth degree how much you are on sides. You're either on the buyer's side with the buyer's agent or the seller's side with the seller's agent. And so it is very important for us to explain, because sometimes, as you see, the buyer may talk to the seller's agent. They're not on the same team. So we've got to explain at certain triggers whom we're representing, how this all flows, and that's typically always step one. But there's some very important laws and rules that come into play there of when you have to disclose this agency disclosure in North Carolina. I told you oral buyer agency agreements are open-ended, meaning there's no period of time on them. You can cancel anytime. And they're non-exclusive. So let's say that Sam calls me up and Sam says, Seth, I'd like to go see 123 Main Street. I said, great. I meet up with Sam. I'm going to explain the working with real estate agents disclosure with Sam. We're going to get there in a second. And then after that, I'm going to turn around and I'm going to say, all right, Sam, we need to enter into some type of oral buyer, or some type of buyer agency agreement. And I can give Sam options. I say, Sam, if you're comfortable, we can do a written buyer agency agreement to begin with. But if you're not comfortable, we can just enter into an oral buyer agency agreement. She says, okay, let's just start with the oral buyer agency agreement. I said, great, no problem. Understand that this is open-ended, Sam. There's no time period on this. You can cancel any time, and it is non-exclusive, Sam. We're going to agree to this verbally that I'm representing you, and I'm going to look after you so long as we maintain this relationship, but I cannot bind you to me only. You are welcome to go out and hire other agents in an oral capacity. So that's what I mean by open-ended and non-exclusive. So Sam could go out and hire Tim and Kingsley and Misty. She could have 17 oral buyer agents at the exact same time. Non-exclusive and no period of time. Everybody okay with that statement? What you got, Sam?
So, but then as soon as if you show me a house and Tim shows me a house and Stephanie shows me a house and I decide, well, I like the house that Seth showed me, I want to make an offer, now we go into agreement.
Now we would have to reduce it to a written buyer agency agreement. And at that point, I'm probably going to have you sign an exclusive buyer agency agreement that says, now it's just the two of us building castles in the sky, Sam, right? It's just me and you, ain't nobody else in it. And so now you can't see those people anymore. That's like the dating thing, right? Now we're Facebook official and it's just me and you. And so now I can put an offer in for you because we have a written buyer agency agreement. Yep. Now, when we're dealing with the working with real estate agents disclosure, or at the very least agency disclosure, okay, there are two very big triggers, and we're going to get into the actual disclosure in a second. But if you are a buyer's agent who is reaching out to a seller or a seller's agent, you would have to disclose that you are representing a buyer at initial contact, the second you start talking to them. Why do you think that might be? So I'm representing Sam the buyer. I pick up the phone to call Misty, the listing agent. Misty's the listing agent representing the seller. The second I call Misty, I have to say, Misty, I'm representing Sam as my buyer client. The second I start talking to Misty. Why?
So that she knows not to tell you some stuff that you would have to tell your client to use against her.
There you go. Because she needs to know that there is a conflict of interest. I am already representing the person who's on the opposite side. And as Jacob said, we want her to know that. The reason why that's so important, folks, I introduced yesterday seller sub-agency. It still exists. It is possible for Misty and I to be on the same team. So that'd be a different phone call. I'd call Misty and say, Misty, I'm going to act as a seller sub-agent representing you and your seller. Same team now. Versus me being with Sam as a buyer's agent, opposite teams. Does that make sense? So you have to disclose that initial contact to a seller or a seller's agent if you are already representing a buyer. The second you start talking to them. Whether it be a for sale by owner or a represented seller, doesn't matter. What you got, Sam?
So if you don't disclose that you're working with Sam, are you doing willful misrepresentation? Are you practicing that?
Well, if you that would be an omission, right? You omitted things that were material by not saying it. So yeah, you would get in trouble for omitting impertinent information. And technically, you'd be in violation of 58A.0104, which is the agency disclosure rule, more specifically, that says this has to be done at initial contact. But understand, I told you there's two different disclosure from sides from a testable point of view. One of them is when you are a buyer's agent, you have to disclose to the seller or seller's agent at initial contact. However, when we get into the working with the real estate agent's disclosure as a broad interpretation and understanding, for everyone else in the world, it is at what we call first substantial contact, which is different. Very big differentiation. Initial contact as soon as we start talking to them. For a substantial contact is when the conversation starts going to confidential territory. I'm going to give you some examples of this in just a moment. But it's still okay so far. So make sure you're tracking with me here. Brenda has an oral buyer agency agreement with Tom. We look at 20 properties over the course of 2 weeks. Tom eventually makes an offer on one of the homes. However, he has his cousin Earl from Spivey's Corner, North Carolina, write the offer for him. What can Brenda do about this?
If it's open-ended and he can go into an agreement with anybody, I'd say that Brenda is
SOL? There you go. SOL. Folks, it was an oral buyer agency agreement. They could lawfully see all these houses, but it was non-exclusive and open-ended. There is nothing stopping her from going and filing a written buyer agency agreement with somebody else, which is where, Kirsten asked earlier, well, doesn't this put you at risk? Yes, it does. And so you're not required to operate with one of these, but it is an option if it's something that we all want to elect to do, as long as we do things the right way.
Beth, how often or how long should you be in this kind of oral buyer agency situation? At what point would you want to go ahead and establish an agreement, an official agreement, a written agreement?
There is no real stance on that. It's whatever you and your firm are most comfortable with. So for me, if it's like a friend, a family member, or somebody I've known for a while, I'll operate for, months on just an oral buyer agency agreement. If it's not somebody I've ever met like that before, I typically have a rule that by the second showing, we got to decide if we're going to work together or not, and we'll reduce it to second, as in second trip out. So I'll take you one day to go see 3 houses. We schedule a second group of houses, and at the end of that, I said, okay, we've seen 6 houses together. We've done 2 trips. You got a good feel yet? And then, maybe ask them to do it in writing at that point. But there's no one size fits all. It's dependent. Depends.
So is the hesitation common that people just don't want to stick to that agreement, I guess, to only be represented by one agent or the agency dynamic?
We're not going to say common, but even the little bit of introduction I've given y'all to contracts, hopefully you realized yesterday that you can't just get out of a contract because you don't want to. So, there is some hesitation. If I'm making you sign a 6 or 7-page document stating that you can work with me and only me for the next 6 months, and if you breach your contract, you might still owe me money. Yeah, there's sometimes some hesitation, but it's not common.
What would you say is the average amount of time for those? Is 6 months the average, or do people kind of start off with just 3?
For an agency agreement? Once again, depends. If they are not in a big hurry, they're not really sure which property, we may do 6 months. If they know exactly which area, what their price point is, they're pre-approved, maybe 3 months. It really depends. Understand there's no rule on how long it can be, but you're going to have to justify it to the client, right? When you say, well, I need you to sign a 3-year agreement with me, they're going to say, why? You need 3 years to help me find a house? Same thing with a seller, right? They're going to say, why? You need 3 years to sell my house? So it's whatever we want to agree to, but you're going to have to justify it. Yeah.
I would think 90 days would be ideal.
Yeah, but then you realize that the average closing takes 45 days. So if you take any longer than 45 days to find the house, then your agency agreement's going to expire before you close, but which you could just extend, and technically you've done your job yet. So it depends. Yeah. So folks, I'm talking about single agency, right? We've got a brokerage firm or broker representing a client, and because of single agency, whether it's seller, whether it's buyer, that means that there is no conflict of interest, just like that buyer I showed you earlier, buyer agency relationship. It means that our person is our person, and everyone else we don't give a crap about. Okay? Single agency is clean, it's neat, it's easy. Because we know where our loyalties reside. There is no conflict of interest. However, though, it rules out in-house transactions. And I'm going to help you have an epiphany with that in just a second. Now, more specifically, this is kind of like the blanketed way to look at it. But realistically, what actually exists is the client hiring the firm, and then they're working with a sub-agent, the individual broker working on behalf of that firm. That's who's assisting them. This is still just exclusive representation, folks. Understand that. Because now there's just two people working for the seller. It's all the same team, though. Coldwell Banker has an agent representing the seller. This is all still seller agency. It's exclusive representation. Now, I need to explain something to you. Seller sub-agency happens two ways. It happens in-house, and it happens across brokerage firms. Remember how I told you this all started? Firms had buyers that didn't like their listings, so what do? They started showing their buyers other people's listings, but everybody worked for the sellers. Well, that still exists today, and so that is going across brokerage firms. So let me just paint two pictures for you here. If Monica hires Coldwell Banker, and I work for Coldwell Banker, technically I am a seller sub-agent. If Manoj also works for Coldwell Banker and ends up doing anything, right, technically he is also a seller sub-agent. And so we're all at the same firm. That is seller sub-agency. Why is this important? Folks, think about this. What if in this office we only work with sellers? And so Manoj is doing something called desk duty. Desk duty is where you sit at the front desk and you answer the phone calls. And that is a lead generation opportunity. People call, they need agents. If you're the one sitting there, you typically get the lead. So Manoj is sitting there doing desk duty, and Monica has been working with me and me only. And somebody calls and they say, I want to see this listing at 123 Main Street, which is my listing. It's Monica's house. Folks, can Manoj take a buyer to go see that house?
Yes.
Yes, as what?
A sub-agent.
A seller sub-agent. Because in this example, I said our firm only works with sellers. So he cannot represent this buyer. But he can take this unrepresented buyer customer to see it. But this is still, even though there's two licensees and a firm, it's still exclusive representation. Who are we all looking after? Monica, the seller. Me, Manoj, all of Coldwell Banker is looking after Monica. Does that make sense? So even though there's multiple people, don't get it confused. This is still exclusive representation. We only care about one party. Now, I'll let you mull that over while you take a break. Come back at 7:25, and I'll give you another example of this to help you understand something very important. So I'm going to explain another scenario to you, and then I'm going to show you something to kind of stress the importance and the understanding that you need to have on this topic, okay? I just gave this scenario with one firm doing seller sub-agency and representing the seller, but I'm going to change it up a little bit, okay? If we take Manoj out of this, okay, we got Monica who's hired Coldwell Banker and by default me because I'm a sub-agent of Coldwell Banker. Jacob just saw your message. Just a possibility. Just keel over, huh? We'll pray for you.
It really is a possibility. It really is. I for reals might die tonight. If I'm not here tomorrow, you guys know why.
We'll know why. That's right. Oh, excuse me. So let's say that Monica hires me and Coldwell Banker. So I'm a sub-agent of Coldwell Banker. Well, it is possible for, let's say, another firm to get a phone call, Okay, I'm just going to put them over here on the side of ABC Realty. And I'll put Kingsley here. And Kingsley gets a phone call. Kingsley gets a phone call from a buyer who wants to see this property. Well, as long as I give Kingsley permission, let's say that Kingsley meets this buyer and he goes through the motions and he tries to disclose how agency works with this buyer. And then he turns around and he tries to enter into a buyer agency agreement with them. And they say no. They don't want Kingsley as their buyer agent. Well, I told you in North Carolina you have to represent somebody. So if I gave him permission, there is the potential for Kingsley to be on my same team and act as what we call a cooperating seller subagent. So we're not the same firm. And this is where things used to go this way before that big lawsuit happened. But the problem with it back then was nobody understood exactly what was happening. Nobody understood these relationships. So would Kingsley have to disclose that that's what was happening to this buyer? Yeah. But Kingsley, even though he's with a different firm, could act as a seller subagent and be on my same team, even from different firms. It's called cooperating seller subagency. Now, it only happens with permission. I don't have to do this, but if I elect to do this, we could. Now, the reason why this is very uncommon is because of what we call vicarious liability. And it's not even so much the customer. It's both. Folks, think about this. If Kingsley and I have never met each other before, and I have no idea what Kingsley knows or doesn't know, isn't there a chance that Kingsley may be an idiot, right? Kingsley might be a terrible real estate agent. He might be a fantastic one, but is there any way for me to know that just off the cuff? So if Kingsley and I agree to work on the same team and Kingsley does something that screws up and damages Monica, Monica may be going after me and Coldwell Banker and Kingsley and ABC, even though I did nothing wrong. But I said they could play on my team. Same thing with the customer, right? If we don't do things right or we share information to that customer, there's a lot of things that could come into play here when you open this up. Now, let me show you something. Because a lot of instructors, I'm going to be very honest with you right now. There are a lot of instructors in North Carolina, and I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but I've seen other people talk about this. They do a terrible job of explaining this, and nobody realizes that it's just quite to the extent that it is. But I want to show you this. When I bring up your syllabus, and this is the old one, not the draft one, because I told you to focus on this one, and you look right here under Brokerage Relationships, Laws and Practice on page 27. Well, you're going to start seeing things like I was talking about. Single agency, where the company's only representing owners for the seller, property owners. Single agency for the buyers, right? Firms that only work with buyers. And then we've got agency relationship when two companies cooperate in a cross-sale or co-broker transaction. When we have two brokerage firms, it's called co-brokering. We are co-brokering a deal. There are two different brokerages getting the deal to its closing. And so there is exclusive representation that can occur within these. And of course, I'm going to get into more examples. But I want you to look right here. Seller subagency. In a co-brokered deal. That's what I just explained to you. Seller subagency can exist in-house, meaning within our brokerage firm. That was what happened with Manoj. And seller subagency with permission could exist across different brokerage firms. Everybody understand that? It's extremely testable to understand this. It's plain as day. It's on the agency section in North Carolina. So let's take this a step further, okay? Here's the thing. Let's introduce dual agency. When I say buyer agency, we only care about the buyer. When I say seller agency, we only care about the seller. But what if it's both? Folks, let me ask you a question. What is, if you were trying to explain it to me like I'm stupid, if I just was born yesterday, and I said, tell me like I'm dumb, what is the job of a buyer's agent, do you think?
To help them find a home to purchase.
To help them find a home to purchase. Is that it?
Being loyal to the buyer.
Being loyal to the buyer. So give me a little bit more.
Negotiate the price, housing price.
Negotiated to what?
The purchase price.
Yeah.
Negotiate based on what they're approved for.
Well,
That's possible price.
there you go. The best possible price. Don't make me pay $600,000 just because I can afford it. You better get me the best stinking deal, right? I don't want to pay more than I have to. You agree with me? So is it safe to say that in layman's term, the job of a buyer's agent is to represent the buyer, get them a house that meets all their needs, and get them the best stinking deal they possibly can? Okay. Well, let's flip the coin. What's your job as a listing agent?
To sell the house for as much money as you can.
You gotta sell. Yeah, you gotta get a buyer and you gotta sell that house for as much money as possible. Folks, you better sell it for so much money that seller wants to make some bad decisions, okay? A sports car starts looking good, and hell, they might try a little bit of Coke because they made so much money. I'm kidding. I'm just making sure y'all are awake. Calm down, okay? I'm just trying to keep y'all with me here. But do you see what I'm saying? Missy's like, oh my Lord, what just happened? The soda, Misty, the soda. Pepsi's fine too, whatever you want, okay? Does this make sense, everybody? So I'm going to give you a very powerful scenario to teach you dual agency. And I'm going to pick on Eliza, okay? So Eliza gets a phone call as a real estate agent from somebody who wants to sell their house. And they call up Eliza. And they hire Eliza to sell their house. We're going to call that client one. Or I'm sorry, client two. We're going to call that the seller. So she gets hired. She signs a listing agreement with the seller. Now, folks, because she is representing this person as a seller client, what does she owe this seller? Like specifically, like we just taught you this. Like what do we owe our clients?
Proper disclosure
Yeah.
of the agency relationship.
Y'all can just give me the blanketed terms that mean all of these things. What was the acronym?
Old car.
Old car. There you go. Fiduciary duties. Just give me the blanket. You owe this client, Eliza owes this client fiduciary duties. Obedience, loyalty, disclosure, accounting, and reasonable skill and care, right? Old car. Everybody cool with that? Well, on top of that, her job is to get them the most money possible. But since it's her client, of course, she owes them confidentiality. She's going to keep their secret secret. So when she meets with this seller, here's what they're going to tell Eliza. They're going to say, Eliza, listen, we're going through a nasty divorce, and that's the reason why we're selling. But it's okay for her to for them to tell her that because she's representing them and looking after their best interest. Well, furthermore, they say, okay, well, Eliza, we want the house to be listed at $550. But, you know, we'd be ecstatic if we got let me make that a little bit. 500. Well, it doesn't matter. Like Eliza can know all their secrets, right? Because Eliza is their agent. Everybody cool with that statement? She's going to look after their best interest. She's not going to share these secrets. She's going to work to get them the best possible deal. You agree?
Yes.
Okay. So I want you to picture the way that this listing process goes. Eliza puts her sign in the yard. She puts the house on the market. She starts getting showings, and then just everything's going well. But then one day, somebody calls Eliza, and they say, Eliza, hey, we saw your sign in the yard of this beautiful listing, and we'd like to go see it. And we're going to call this person an unrepresented buyer. Can Eliza show this unrepresented buyer this house?
Yes.
Yes, she can. Folks, your job as a listing agent is to get the house sold. Showing it to the most buyers helps get that house sold, does it not? So she's just doing her job representing the seller. And I told you in North Carolina you have to have a person. Well, Eliza has a person. Who is it?
Ourselves.
The seller. The seller. So this unrepresented buyer calls her. Now, I'm going to go ahead and eke something in here because I like for you to have multifaceted learning points. Eliza is going to have to disclose her agency status before she shows this home to the buyer. But we'll come back more to the working with real estate agents disclosure in a second. So she discloses, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Unrepresented Buyer, my name is Eliza, I'm representing the sellers. Here's the working with real estate agents disclosure, just so you understand how this works and that, I'm just showing you the house. So they see the house and they love it. And they say, well, Eliza, I understand you work for the seller, but listen, Eliza, we really like you and we think that, you're just great. And we want you to represent us too. You think that's allowed?
It's kind of, I don't know if it's allowed, but it's complicated because they would have to then give old car to both people, which you can't really do.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's allowed.
Okay. So let's go with it's allowed. Now, the answer is, folks, it is allowed. But it is only allowed with informed and written consent. You can never do this secretly. You would have to look the seller and the buyer in the face and tell them that you are going to be representing both of them. So let's say that that's what happens. It's allowed. And so now Eliza also has the buyers. And now she's got these buyers that she also owes old car to, like Jacob said. And here's what the buyers say. The buyers say, well, Eliza, listen, we really like this house and we're so excited that you can represent both of us. We have $700,000 in cash in the bank right now. And we are really excited about this. And listen, we need to be under contract soon because we've got a job transfer that means that, we need to make this happen faster, okay? And so now she knows all these things. And so now here's what the buyers say. They look Eliza in the eyeballs and they say, now, Eliza, listen, what should we offer on this property?
She should start at $550.
But that's what the sellers are asking for.
She should start at $550 because that's what the sellers are asking for. That's one insight.
I think that would probably be a situation where the seller or where the agent would have to say, I can't give you advice here. What do you think we should offer? Or what do you want me to offer for you?
No advice.
But by the time the buyer asks Eliza what price she should be offering, the seller would already have a price set on the house.
They do. They have it set for $550, but they told her they would accept $500.
Yeah, $550 is the list price. So it's actively listed in the MLS for $550. But she knows that the seller would go as low as $500.
And the buyer can pay as much as $700.
And the buyer has $700,000 in cash right now.
I would say $600,000.
Joshua wants commission.
I would say $550 right there. That's best. Hopefully listing has done its proper due diligence as far as what's the house value or the worth and all that.
Folks.
Or kind of like what Jacob said. You could say to them, they're asking $550. What offer would you like to make? You put the ball in their court. I don't know.
Or maybe they can give advice, but not advice as a number. So instead of saying, "Oh, I think you should offer $500," you should. They say, "I think that you can offer under asking price," or saying, "I think you need to offer over asking price."
I think they can, Eliza is only going to be able to act as a facilitator, and that all confidences will have to be kept. And,
There you go.
yeah, I don't see how Eliza could do either or.
And also,
Not if she owes fiduciary relationships to both the buyer and the seller. She can't do it.
I would say it depends on the type of market that we're in. So like if we refer back to COVID, we were bouncing between the seller's market and the buyer's market. So you don't think so, Misty?
We're definitely still in a seller's market.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I mean, it's definitely slowed down. It's not like it was. But, folks, are y'all ready for the epiphany? I asked you some precursor questions for a reason. Your job as a buyer's agent is to get the best freaking deal for your buyer. Your job as the seller's agent is to get the most freaking money for your seller. And so y'all went around and around and around and around. But listen, if you say $550, you've hurt the buyer because you know the seller would go less. If you say $700, right, you've hurt the buyer. If you say $500, you've hurt the seller. So if you give any advice at all, then you have hurt somebody. If you help one, you hurt the other. And so here's the epiphany, the first epiphany to have with dual agency. Mr. About to Drop Dead nailed it from the word go. Folks, you can't give advice, and that goes above and beyond price. So think about it. If you give advice on the price, you've hurt one or the other. But now once we're under contract, if you tell the buyer to have a home inspection, who does that hurt? The seller? If you tell the seller to not do repairs, who does that hurt? The buyer? Just about every single thing in a transaction could constitute advice. And because you have made promises to both, you really can't do anything. You are worthless because you made promises to look after both. Now, a word of caution. Misty then came in and said, well, you're kind of like a facilitator. You are, but here's the funny thing. You can't use that word directly. You got to be very careful because I told you yesterday that some states have what they call facilitation or transactional brokers, where they have loyalties to nobody. And so they are basically just paper pushers and they say, what do you want to do? Ironically enough, dual agency works the exact same way. But instead of having loyalties to nobody, you have loyalties to everybody, which also makes you worthless and a paper pusher. Just don't confuse it and say that it's transactional brokerage. It's not. It just acts identical to it because one has loyalties to nobody, transactional brokerage. One has loyalties to everybody, dual agency. Now, folks, here is the even bigger epiphany that I need you to have. How dare I put Eliza's name here? Because Eliza's not the agent. Who is?
The firm.
The firm. So if Eliza works for ABC, I want you to understand something here. If I was to change this slightly, I'm going to erase this. I'm going to show you what I mean. ABC is here. The seller called Eliza first. And then now in the scenario, the way I played it out, when this buyer called the firm, she didn't talk to Eliza. She talked to Corey. And so Corey actually has been talking to and knows all these secrets about the buyer. So now we've got Corey and Eliza. And as you look at this picture, I need you to understand a very, very critical truth. Nothing has changed. Because if Eliza gives advice to the seller, ABC has hurt the buyer. If Corey gives advice to the buyer, ABC has hurt the seller. Dual agency, by definition, is when the firm represents the buyer and the seller in the same transaction, not the individual licensee. The individual licensee is legal. It does happen, but I like to call that true dual agency. But this is still dual agency. And you are still worthless. You can still give no advice. Nothing changed. Remember on the beginning of class yesterday, in the beginning of class, I said you've got to understand that the firm is the agent. This is why. Because if you think about the individual licensee, you will get the test question wrong. Corey's working with the buyer, Eliza's working with the seller. They both work for ABC Realty. What should Corey do to help his buyer? Nothing. If Corey gives advice to that buyer, he has done dual agency wrong. If Eliza gives advice to this seller, she has done dual agency wrong.
Now, Seth, I might be jumping ahead, but does designated dual agency change this scenario? Okay.
Understand that when you are tested on dual, your brain has to default to bound, gagged, worthless. You can't help or hinder anybody. By the way, the test is not very often going to use the word dual. They're going to say what I just said. Corey and Eliza both work for ABC Realty, and that is all the information they'll give you for you to figure out it's dual. And then you've got to approach the question as nobody can help anybody.
So why did you hire them to represent you?
That's an excellent question, Kingsley. What's the point? The point will be revealed in just a second. So dual agency is when the firm, not the individual licensee, but the firm represents the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. And a dual agent's loyalties are equally divided between the parties, which means you cannot help or hinder or hurt either party, which makes you worthless. So let me take this a step further. If you see the term disclosed dual agency, that's not the same thing as designated. Folks, disclosed dual agency is the only way that dual agency is legal. Okay? You cannot do this without informed and written consent. You have to tell the parties that you're representing both. You would have to explain it to them, and you would have to get written consent from both in order to be able to do dual agency. So if somebody was to do this without disclosing it and without permission, it would be illegal or undisclosed illegal dual agency. This would be a violation of license laws in North Carolina as well. In fact, I'll show it to you. We keep looking at this license laws and commission rules. Look right here, number 4, I believe it is. Acting for more than one party in a transaction without the knowledge of all parties for whom he or she acts. Translates to undisclosed dual agency. That is a prohibited act subject to disciplinary action in North Carolina. So you can only legally do it with informed and written consent. Now, folks, I just made a very big point about dual agency because you will get a lot of questions on the North Carolina test about dual agency. A lot. And you have to approach them exactly as I just did. Don't you ever get tricked just because there's 2 licensees that now you're advocating. You're not. There is no advocating on behalf of either party in just dual agency, and your brain needs to default to that level. 1 licensee, 2 licensees, doesn't matter. If it's dual, you're worthless. no helping anybody. But there is a very specific type of dual agency called designated dual agency. Designated dual agency is not the default. On a test question, you will have to read the word designated, or there will have to be something indicative of that's what we're doing. Because if it doesn't say it, don't you ever answer a question as designated. So designated is where it is a dual agency transaction, but what we have specifically done within the firm is we have designated one specific licensee to go for blood for the buyer, and one specific licensee to go for blood for the seller. It has been specifically stated that that's what's going to happen. I want you to think of it as like a very formal hierarchical or like a knighting ceremony, right? Like the big comes in, and forevermore it shall be that Kingsley shall represent, or I'm sorry, it's Corey. Corey shall represent only the interests of the buyer, and that Eliza shall represent only the interests of the seller, and they shall go for blood, and no other party shall participate in this transaction. It's quite literally, you have to be designated to go for blood. In just dual agency, you're worthless. But now what we've done is we've specifically stated, okay, we've got one licensee in our firm of many that's really looking after the interest of the buyer. One licensee in our firm of many that is looking out for the interest of the seller. And so I need you to understand something. I'm going to give you some more insight into this word exclusive in a second, but please understand that this is not exclusive representation. Don't ever get tripped up on a test. Because if I say buyer agency, well, we are exclusively representing the interest of the buyer. If I say seller agency, we're exclusively representing the interest of the seller. But this is still dual agency. It just acts like exclusive, but it's not. Because it's still one firm, the agent, representing both. But we have split off two individual licensees, one going for blood for one going for blood for the other. So let's go back to the Corey-Eliza scenario. We throw Corey and Eliza in this proverbial boxing ring, and we're all eating popcorn on the sidelines. And we're yelling, "Go for blood!" And everybody's like, "Which one?" And like, "We don't know. We're impartial. We're all dual agents over here, but they can go for blood." Right? Hit them in the kidneys. How are we feeling? So, let me make a statement here. You will never have dual agency in a co-brokered transaction. Co-brokered means two brokerage firms. It is impossible. Co-brokered transactions are always exclusive representation. Let me say that again. Co-brokered transactions are always exclusive representation. It is impossible to have dual agency. ABC Realty and XYZ Realty doing a deal together. One represents the seller, one represents the buyer. That's not dual agency. Dual agency is when one firm represents the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. Very specifically, the same transaction. Let me give you a visual that's going to help you with this. Real Estate Commission website again. Still on publications. Q&A brochures. I'm going to throw this in the chat for you too. There used to be a brochure version of the Working with Real Estate Agents disclosure, and they changed the form. So the one that I'm going to show you in a moment is not the brochure. But what they did with the brochure is they repurposed it and they added, you ready for this? Pictures. Pictures, because this is so confusing, they wanted to help y'all out. Start here. This is a co-brokered transaction. Let's call the red people Keller Williams, the blue people Coldwell Banker. This is exclusive representation. No conflict of interest. Keller Williams is going for blood for the buyer. Coldwell Banker is going for blood for the seller. Everybody cool with that statement? This is a co-brokered deal, and co-brokered deals, dual agency never arises. Well, let's start with the first example I gave you. There's Eliza. Dual agency. Dual agency could happen with one licensee within a brokerage firm. Dual agency could happen with one sole proprietor or sole practitioner operating independently. It's legal, but notice what they're doing. They're holding hands with both. Folks, these folks are singing Kumbaya by the fire. Ain't no hostility here. Can't help or hurt anybody. Here's Corey and Eliza. What are they all doing?
Kumbaya.
Kumbaya. They are cooking s'mores by the fire, singing Kumbaya. To the extent, folks, that when that seller is eating a s'more, right, gets a little chocolate, Corey's going to be like, oh, let me get that for you. Let me just help me out there. And then Corey's going to boop, and Corey's going to go, boop, gotcha, boop. Because everybody is friendly. You can't help or hurt anybody. Notice how there's no difference in the name of these. They're both dual agency. They're both bound and gagged and worthless. No helping, no hurting. Bam. Now we have created a divide. There is no longer hand-holding. Same color, same firm, but we have specifically stated that one licensee, and it could be more than one, but a designated group of licensees or one licensee is representing only the interest of the buyer. And a different licensee or licensees is representing only the interest of the seller. And this is where we said, you specific folks can go for blood. What you got, Kirsten?
So, when would or why would there ever be a dual agency scenario with two brokers if designated dual agency is available?
Excellent question. The question that Kirsten just asked, why would we ever do this if this is available? And there's a couple of reasons. Number one is sometimes, under certain circumstances, this is prohibited by law. And I'm about to tell you when you can't legally do this. The other thing is, Kirsten, a lot of people do not understand how this works, even on the actual practicing brokerage level. I hate to say it. And so there is a lot of firms that will have silly policies that state, well, we don't do this, but we do this. It's not in anybody's best interest, but you could have policies that state all of these are legal. You can do any of these. But it would be up to the firm on what they want to do and whatnot. So let me give you some insight here, okay? Folks, there are a couple of rules as to when designated dual agency is prohibited by law. I'll give you two, technically three. I told you that when you all go and you get your license, it will be issued on what two statuses in North Carolina?
Non-provisional.
Provisional.
Provisional. Non-provisional is a full broker. It's issued on provisional. Non-provisional is what comes next. Non-provisional broker, full broker, all of those are synonyms. So you are issued on provisional status. And what's the other status?
Current, right? You're current and provisional?
Technically, you're current because your license was issued, but that... what?
Active?
Non-active.
Inactive.
Inactive. You are, there we go. Listen, y'all said enough words. We were bound to get there eventually, right? Your license is issued in North Carolina on provisional and inactive status. Well, just remind me, how do you move from provisional to non-provisional?
The 90 hours of
Continuous education.
Post-licensing education. There you go. 3 30-hour post-licensing courses, okay? That was just a quiz. Now, here's the real reason I'm bringing this up. What would you have to do to activate your provisional license?
BIC. Sign up with a BIC.
Affiliate with a BIC. Folks, I want you to picture this. When you get your license, do you think that you're going to have a freaking clue what to do?
No,
No. Who do you think's probably going to teach you what to do?
you're big.
Your BIC. Welcome to rule number 1 in North Carolina of when this is not allowed. You cannot do designated dual agency as a PB going against your broker in charge. We do not allow it by law.
Well, that makes sense because they're the one teaching you, so they're going to.
Folks, I want you to picture the Karate Kid fighting Mr. Miyagi the day he started training. He would have gotten his ASS whooped, right? That poor kid would have had every bone in his body broken. Not really fair, is it? Now, it's not the Karate Kid we're worried about. It's whoever bet on the Karate Kid. Because it's not going to be fair to the buyer that's using the PB, but the BIC has access to all their files, knows all the buyer's secrets, knows all of this crap. Is that fair to this buyer? No. So we do not allow designated with a PB against a BIC. The other time that designated is not allowed is if one of the brokers have already received confidential information about the opposite party. So let's go back to Corey and Eliza again. Eliza had the listing for the past 3 weeks. Her and Corey were sitting in the break room, and she tells Corey that her sellers would take $500,000. She's so tired of them because they call her every day. They're mad at her because she hasn't sold it yet. Yada, yada, yada. She tells all these secrets to Corey. And now Corey gets a phone call from these buyers, and they want to do designated dual agency. Folks, they can't. Because Corey knows secrets about the seller. You cannot be a designated dual agent if you already know secrets about the opposite party. And understand that you can't have designated without it first being a type of dual. So dual still has to exist for the times that this is prohibited, and designated can't exist unless dual exists. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
I got a question.
Okay.
A provisional broker can work with another BIC at another firm that's under the umbrella of the larger firm as a designated dual agent. Can that happen?
Yes, hang tight though.
All right, I'm kind of jumping.
Yeah, a little bit, because it's an excellent question. It's an excellent question. So hang tight.
All right.
Yeah. So, folks, let me ask you a question, okay? I want you to look me in the eyes. I'm going to ask you a question, okay? Can a provisional broker and their BIC do dual agency?
Yes.
No.
Only if the BIC is working as their mentor and not the other broker in the deal.
No.
I think that they can do dual agency as long as they don't do designated dual agency.
Folks, Mr. Deathbed got it again. I asked, can they do dual agency? You cannot call these the same thing. They cannot do designated dual agency against each other. But of course, a PB and their BIC can do this. Where's the danger? We're holding hands and singing Kumbaya by the fire. Don't you let this get you on the test. Can a provisional broker and their BIC do dual agency? Yes. Can a provisional broker and their BIC do designated dual agency against each other? No. One word changes the entire question. Now, one other thing to be aware of where they try to trick you with this, please understand that you will get questions that say, which of the following is the best example of dual agency? And I'll give you two of the most commonly picked answer choices, and I want you to piece through this. A firm that works with both buyers and sellers, or a broker in charge doing a deal with their provisional broker.
They're the same.
They're not the same.
No.
There's only one right answer.
I was thinking about something
Repeat it
else.
again.
Can you say it again?
Yeah.
Repeat it again, Seth.
Yeah. Which of the following would be the best example of dual agency? A firm that works with buyers and sellers, a broker in charge doing a deal with their provisional broker.
A broker in charge.
Broker in charge of the provisional broker.
That's it. Folks, a lot of firms work with both buyers and sellers all the time. It's not dual agency until what?
You're brokeraging, oh my gosh, I can't talk. Brokering a deal with a broker that works for the same brokerage as you do. Let's see how many times I can say broker.
Broker, 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 broker.
When they have a written consent?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the only time it's lawful. But the thing is, what if ABC Realty had 500 sellers and 500 buyers, but none of those buyers are buying any of these listings? There's no dual agency happening. Dual agency doesn't arise until a buyer that is represented by our firm wants to buy a listing that is represented by our firm. It is very specifically the same transaction. So a firm that works with both buyers and sellers, that's not dual agency. It has to be us representing both in the same transaction.
So, Seth, I would think this happens often. So, what is the typical way that brokerages go about this?
Designated.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Mm-hmm. Now, some firms may have policies where they don't do designated. Now, let me tell you where that makes sense. A friend of mine has a firm, and it is him and 3 other people. You ready for this? It is him, it's his mama, it's his best friend, and it's another friend. Folks, they are some chatty Cathys. So that small itty-bitty firm has a policy where they do not do designated dual agency. Why?
Because they probably share information that they get, so
it would never even be lawful to do it anyway because they probably have already received confidential information about the other parties. Now that you're understanding this, let me take this a step further, folks. I'm going to go back to here, and I'm going to bring back Corey and Eliza. And in that dual agency scenario, we knew all these secrets about the seller, right? That they would take $500,000, even though it was listed at $550,000. And Corey knew that this person had $700,000 in cash. And so there's all these secrets. And so I'm going to tell you something here, and I want you to tell me if we have a problem or not. Corey looks Eliza in the face and says, Eliza, guess what? My buyer has $700,000 in cash in the bank right now. Do we have a problem?
You're talking about in this scenario that you just
In
showed
this scenario right here.
No.
No.
I don't think it's a problem unless Eliza tells the seller.
So let me take this a step further. If she does what she's supposed to do, is it a problem?
Yes.
Well, what is she supposed to do in dual agency?
Represent both.
No. Well, I mean, she's supposed to represent both. So let me just make sure that you're understanding the question here. Is it a problem that she knows that the buyer has $700,000 if she is doing dual agency appropriately?
Yes,
Yes.
Why?
because that's confidential information about the buyer.
Uh-huh.
She's representing the buyer also. She's representing the seller and the buyer.
But she can't say anything because then she would be breaking.
So that's what I'm asking. If she does what she's supposed to do, is it a problem? No. Because if she's not going to tell this person, it doesn't matter. They can tell each other all the secrets about everybody because they can't tell it to these people. Doesn't matter for these two to know. They can't use it.
If you move it down to the designated one, they can't talk about it.
There you go. That's exactly right. Then it'd be a problem for them to share that information where it's go for blood territory. But folks, you have to be very careful about these questions because sometimes these questions will ask if it's a problem for licensees in an office to communicate the secrets. No, not technically, because everybody works for everybody. That's the whole premise of sub-agency. But the reason why you wouldn't is because if everybody shares all the secrets, this would never be allowed. So you got to be very careful of the context of the question.
So, Seth, in all actuality, Corey and Eliza are basically the same agent.
For all intents and purposes, yeah. I mean, of course, there are two different licensees, but that's why I gave you the scenario with Eliza first. It works no different whether it was just Eliza or Eliza and Corey if we're just talking about dual agency.
Okay. Yeah, I think I understand that a little bit better.
Now, of course, I gave you the two main times that you can't do designated. There's one that's just by default that you can't do designated. Folks, it is impossible to do designated if you are a one-person firm or a one-person sole proprietor. Designated is impossible because you need at least two licensees for designated. Now, let me give you another example of test questions that you could see. If we had a firm that was comprised of a broker in charge and one provisional broker, what would be impossible?
Designated dual agent.
Designated dual agency. Because if that's the only members of the firm, it is prohibited for designated. But what would be possible for that firm?
Dual agency.
Dual. Ta-da.
Picture's better. It makes more sense.
That's why I teach it with it. I explain
But
it.
you're gonna put the pictures on the test.
I wouldn't know, but now you get a better understanding of it, don't you?
I want to go back to kindergarten with pictures.
Listen, that's why they put the pictures, Stephanie, because that's the way you teach people at that level. And this is so confusing to so many people. That's what, like, okay, we'll just call it that level. Give them some pictures. And it helps. Imagine teaching this class 5 years ago when these pictures didn't exist. I had to draw them, but, you know, it's, yeah, so. There you go.
This reminds me of trying to teach people algebra and they just stare at you like, I have no clue what you're talking about.
You think that's bad? You should see most of y'all's faces, right? Like it's just like looking like a Picasso painting because y'all are just so stressed out. Why is she doing this to us? Just mushing your faces around, just like worried about some of y'all.
Picasso cake.
Yeah. So, do not ever approach a test question as designated automatically. Dual is the default. I told you in the test there is defaults for everything, and you would need special verbiage, special information to realize that it's designated. Don't ever all automatically answer that way. So here's the visual for you. It cannot be designated if the agent has received confidential information on the opposite party, or we cannot have the provisional broker cannot go against their broker in charge. Now, folks, I'm going to give you a very advanced lesson here. I'm going to make a statement that's not going to reflect anything on your test, but I'm going to make another statement that will reflect something on your test.
Lord Jesus.
Yeah. I keep using Coldwell Banker as the example, Keller Williams as the example. Folks, all of these are basically franchises. They're like a McDonald's. If you want to pay enough money, you can open a Coldwell Banker. If you want to pay enough money, you can open a Keller Williams. But they're different firms. Coldwell Banker Advantage is different than Coldwell Banker HPW. Is different than Coldwell Banker Seacoast Advantage. Is different than Coldwell Banker Partners. Or they're all different firms. That's not going to be on your test though. We're going to use very simplistic things like ABC Realty, XYZ Realty, and that's just going to be a blanketed firm. Now here's the thing that will be on your test, and I'm telling you this because it's on your test and because Tim asked it and I told him I would answer it. You could be tested on this, but let me just give you a visual because I know y'all like your visuals. So here is Coldwell Banker HPW. These are all offices of Coldwell Banker HPW.
Good Lord.
And so first I want to point out one thing. This right here is what is called a firm license number. So these offices are all the same firm. So I want you to piece this together. If an agent from this office did a deal with an agent from this office, what would that be?
Dual agent.
Dual agency, because the firm is representing the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. It could be dual, it could be designated dual, depending, and they would typically default to designated dual. Now here's the question that Tim asked, and I'm going to answer it. If Tim worked for Glenn as a PB, Tim cannot do a designated dual agency deal against Glenn because it's his BIC. These are the BICs, broker in charge. But Tim could do a designated dual agency deal against Greg because Greg is not his BIC. So you could see that on the test. Tim is doing, affiliated with the Raleigh office of XYZ Realty. And he wants to do designated dual agency against the BIC of the, Cary office. Can he do that? Yes, because it is not his BIC. So it is not just that a BIC can't do it against anybody. It's that a BIC can't do designated dual agency against their own provisional broker. Now, I want you to understand, every other combination is okay. A PB can do designated against another PB. A PB can do designated against a full broker. A full broker can do designated dual agency against their own BIC. The only rule... Full broker can. So when you give them like these separations, right? BIC at the top of the totem pole, full broker, and then PB. This is a no-go. Every other combination is okay. BIC against another BIC, BIC against a full broker against a PB, PB against a full broker, PB against a PB. Every other combination is okay. It's just a BIC cannot do designated against their provisional broker, directly under their supervision. Whew.
That makes sense.
Make sense? Anybody throwing up in their mouth yet?
Nope.
Justin says that you speak for yourself. I did like 6 times already, right? Just swallow it back down. Just move on with our lives. So I told you, most of the time on the test, it's going to talk about one designated agent. It could be multiple people. We could say Dora and Manoj are representing the buyer, and Misty and Stephanie are representing the seller. It would still work the same way. It's just those multiple people are designated for this one person. The others are for the other. Okay, nothing too crazy there. Then we're going to get into the agency disclosure and some other pieces. But if you're tracking with me, you're doing great, because this is, of course, a very in-depth conversation. There's a lot that goes into it, and I'm going to keep using examples, and then this will tie into, other concepts as we go along. But this is advanced stuff. It's not easy. Now, just a couple points of clarity here that could come up yet again under North Carolina license laws and rules. You can't do anything that would constitute a conflict of interest. And so, as a real estate broker, you could represent yourself in selling your own property. That is one of the perks of the job. And lawfully, it's okay for a real estate broker to represent the buyer and the seller in the same transaction, as long as there is informed and written consent. Well, it should go without saying that you cannot represent a buyer if you are selling your own property. That is a huge conflict of interest. You cannot be a dual agent representing yourself as the seller and a buyer to buy your property, because a dual agent has to be unbiased, has to not have a conflict of interest. This is a huge conflict of interest. And I don't know if it's going to appear on your test. However, the rule does actually go into some detail to say, except if it's a commercial property and the broker has less than a 25% interest in that property and they disclose it, they could represent a buyer on that commercial property. But in a residential sale that you own, no. So let me ask you a question here. Billy is a provisional broker with Go Realty and works out of the Durham office. His client is very interested in buying a home listed by Brandon White, broker in charge of the Go Realty Raleigh office. Can Billy and Brandon work as designated agents on this sale?
Yes. Yes.
There you go. We got Durham. We got Raleigh.
Yes.
Different BICs. There you go. Whoop, whoop. This is close enough to time. I don't want to have to circle back around. So I'll let you go ahead and take a break. And then we'll start talking about the agency disclosure, which is another very important piece. Okay. So come back at 8:40 and then we'll keep rocking and rolling. So we're having these conversations a little more in depth on agency, talking about exclusive representation, talking about, buyer agency, seller agency, dual agency, of dual, designated. But let's kind of take a few steps back. Okay, let's circle back around. I told you whenever we were representing somebody as an agent that we owed them old car, and part of that old car was confidentiality. And so I made a statement at that point. I said, well, you would never disclose your client's confidential information. But if you found out confidential information, at least in the right way, about a customer, you would have to disclose that to your client. So I'm going to articulate it the way I said it last time, right? You would never disclose your client's confidential information to a customer, but you would have to disclose a customer's confidential information to your client. And because of that, there are certain things, certain rules that come into place with informing the public on how agency works. Because as I keep saying up until now, you've probably never realized just exactly how divided and I'm not going to say cutthroat, but just like really one-sided it is, right? You're our person or you're not. And so when we start talking about things that would constitute confidential information, a lot of times it's articulated as price terms motivation. But really and truthfully, I want you to think of confidential information as anything that could help somebody in a transaction or hurt somebody, right? If it could be used against somebody in a transaction, it's confidential information. Willingness to pay more than what they offered. Need to sell quick. Willingness to accept less than list price. Why am I buying? How fast do I need to close? Any of these things, right? Price terms motivation. But at the end of the day, any of these things that could change somebody's negotiation position. All of these constitute confidential information. And so what we're getting into now is the agency disclosure, which we refer to as the working with real estate agents disclosure. And there is a very specific and very testable trigger for when this disclosure is required to be given. Now, before I give you the generalized terminology again, I want to circle back around to make sure you can distinguish and differentiate this from what I already said. If you are already representing very specifically a buyer, when would you have to disclose your agency status to a seller or a seller's agent?
Well, immediately, right?
Immediately. The way that we articulated that was initial contact. The second you start talking to them. That is very specifically if you are already representing a buyer, and as a buyer's agent, you were talking to a seller or a seller's agent. Everybody okay with that statement? That's when initial contact comes into play. For every other testable scenario, the trigger for disclosing your agency status is at what we call first substantial contact. That is the point when a conversation starts to move into confidential territory. First substantial contact. Now, there's a couple more very important things that I need to warn you about from a testable point of view. Understand that the way that we disclose agency status in North Carolina is with a written agency disclosure called the Working with Real Estate Agents disclosure. Yes, I said written. There is an actual form I'm going to introduce you to in a second, and you have to provide that form. Does it have to be a paper copy? No. But you would either email it to them, provide it, copy, paper copy, whatever. They have to get that form. So it is a written disclosure. Another very important thing to understand is it is only required in sales transactions. Talking to potential buyers, potential sellers. This includes both residential and commercial deals. What that means is, if you get a phone call from a potential tenant, somebody that wants to rent an apartment, do you have to give them this form?
Rent?
Yes. So,
Yes, because they're working, right? Aren't they working with you? They're working with a real estate agent.
Sales of every sales transaction.
sales. Is a tenant buying anything?
We provide it in my job, and at the bottom, it tells the tenant that we represent the landlord.
There's a difference between sure you could give it to somebody and it's required. Understand you'll be tested on requirements. It is not required in sales. It is only required in sales transactions. It is not required to give this to a prospective tenant. Could you give it to them? Sure, but not required. Folks, you're never going to be tested on what you could do. You're going to be tested on the laws, the rules, the obligations, the deadlines, the expectations. Let me give you an example of how important this is. Folks, as a real estate broker out here in the real world selling homes, when do you think would probably the most convenient and practical time to give a potential buyer or seller the disclosure would be?
When you first meet them?
When you first meet them. But that's not required. And so don't you ever answer a test question as you give it to you when you first meet them. That's not the answer. The answer is going to be, when is the deadline? What is the last moment? We're not teaching you best practices. We're teaching you laws and rules and things that are testable. So could you sometimes do things sooner than what is legally required? Yes, but that's not what we're going to test you on. So I'll say it again. This is required in sales transactions only. Buying, selling, potential buyers and sellers, both residential and commercial. This would not be required to be given to a potential property owner if you're acting as their property manager because they're not buying or selling. This would not be required to be given to a potential tenant because they're not buying or selling. The ways the rules are written, it very clearly says sales transactions. Potential buyers, potential sellers, residential and commercial. Now, this is a record, and so remember when we had the delivery of instruments rule, that was all things have to be delivered immediately in no case later than 3 days. Well, then we've got another rule that also uses a 3, but it's different. It's 3 years. All records in North Carolina have to be retained for 3 years from the date of last activity. Now, what that means is if I give somebody working with real estate agents disclosure the day I meet them, and I never see them again, I need to keep that disclosure for 3 years. If I give somebody a working with real estate agents disclosure the day I meet them, and then I go on to help them close on a house 6 months later, I need to keep that disclosure for 3 years from that date their house closed. The date of last activity. So here's the thing that I'm trying to impress upon you. In theory, when we're dealing with the start to finish, you meet somebody, there's a trigger to give them working with real estate agents disclosure, and then you form an agency relationship. That is the progression of things. So you should not be entering into an agency agreement without having done this. Now I'm going to make a very, 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 very important statement. The agency disclosure never, ever, ever, ever forms an agency relationship with anybody. They will try to eat you alive on the test by saying, oh, you provided the working with real estate agents disclosure and told them about the different types of agency, and then they are going to expect you to answer that y'all are in an agency agreement. No. Agency agreements form an agency relationship. When we get into this in just a second, the agency disclosure is just, hey, here's how agency works. That's all it is. So I want you to think of the agency disclosure as a menu of options. That's what it is. We're not even asking you to pick anything on the menu yet. We're just telling you that there's a menu that exists and explaining what is available to you. Now let me make one more statement here. This disclosure is in writing. If you ever have a test question that says something about it being in writing, yes, it is a written disclosure. Now do understand that when I go back to what I was talking about earlier, that buyer agency thing, when you're talking to a seller or a seller's agent, that would happen verbally initially and then ultimately make it in writing in the sales contract. But when we're doing the actual agency disclosure, when at all possible, and I'll give you some more examples of this, it's a written disclosure. So first substantial contact, let me try to paint a picture for you here. What did I just tell you first substantial contact was?
Before the start of any conversation moves towards anything confidential.
Yeah, or exactly as it's moving into it, right? Because we're not mind readers. So sometimes the only way for us to know the conversation is going there is for them to start saying it. Okay, and so let me give you an example of this. Folks, hopefully you all know what an open house is, but if you don't, it is where a real estate broker holds the house open on typically a weekend for the general public to come in and see the pretty house. Everybody somewhat familiar with this concept of an open house? So, as a real estate broker, I want you to think about this, okay? If, I'm going to actually draw this out for you. If Stephanie takes a listing, should I pick somebody with a shorter name? Stephanie, you just did me dirty. I was about to, but I'm like, whatever. Stephanie, if Stephanie takes a listing, okay, at 123 Main Street, we'll just put Main Street, you get it. And Stephanie works for ABC Realty. Well, sometimes agents will hold their own open houses for their listings, but sometimes they will let other people in their firm do them. So let's say that I work at Stephanie's same firm, and I hold an open house for Stephanie this upcoming weekend. Before I take this any further, folks, who do I work for?
ABC Realty.
ABC.
And more specifically?
Stephanie.
And more specifically?
The seller.
The seller. I am a seller sub-agent, right? My loyalties are to the seller, just like Stephanie's are, because everybody with an ABC technically owes their loyalties to the seller. Everybody okay with that statement based on everything I've taught you thus far? Okay. So I hold this house open. And so then I have all these potential unrepresented buyers walking into these doors of this open house that I'm holding open. And for every single one of them, here's how the conversation goes. They say, "Oh my God, this house is so beautiful." I said, "I know, isn't it?" They said, "Are you the listing agent?" I say, "Well, no, I'm a sub-agent of the firm. I'm holding this open for the listing agent, Stephanie." I say, "Great, how many bedrooms is it?" And I say, "It's 4 bedrooms." They say, "How many bathrooms is it?" And I say, "It was 2.5. And they say, "What's the list price?" And I say, $550. And they say, "Is there anything cool nearby?" I said, "Lots of restaurants and shopping." "Would you mind if we look around?" Make yourself at home. Let me know if you have any questions. Did I have to give them a working with real estate agents disclosure at any point?
No.
No. None of that was confidential. None of that constituted for substantial contact. There was no trigger. So that's what you're going to be tested on. The deadline. Did you do it right? Not, could I hand it to them when they walked in? Sure, I could. There's nothing prohibiting me from handing it to them when they walked in, but it's not a requirement. Let me change something. Josh walks in. Josh asks me all the same questions. How many bedrooms? How many bathrooms? What's the list price? All that stuff. And I answer. And Josh says, "Well, great, because I really like this house, and I have $550,000 in the bank, and I'm trying to get under contract on something this weekend." Have Josh and I had first substantial contact?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Because that is very confidential information that I could use against Josh in a negotiation. So, folks, the second the conversation starts moving that way, I would look at Josh and be like, "Shh, shh, Josh, don't tell me your secrets, Josh. Shh." And I'm going to boop Josh on the nose. You've got to stop them. Okay? The second the conversation starts going there, you got to stop them. And then you've got to explain the working with real estate agents disclosure. Folks, who knows what the Miranda rights are?
You have the right to remain silent. Anything that you
There you go. Listen, there's about 10 bajillion law shows. Every single one of you probably knows what the Miranda rights are, right? It is what they read to you when they slap the handcuffs on your back, so you know that you don't have to self-incriminate yourself. Otherwise, it can and will be used against you in a court of law. And so I want you to think of the working with real estate agents disclosure as the real estate version of the Miranda rights. So I'm going to look at Josh. I'm going to say, "Josh, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a real estate transaction. Josh, don't you tell me your secrets, because I'm going to have to use them against you." Does that make sense?
Yep.
So the trigger is first substantial contact. If we never had first substantial contact, then we don't have to provide one. But there are certain things that automatically constitute first substantial contact, like showing a house. If somebody calls you and wants to see a house, remember that scenario where Eliza was a listing agent and I said this unrepresented buyer called and wanted to see that house? Yeah, Eliza could show it, but Eliza would have to go over the working with the real estate agent's disclosure before she did it. Why? What do you think might be a really big question that we commonly ask before we want to show you a house?
Do you have funding?
Do you have funding? And if they tell us all about their funding, that's confidential. You see how that works? So let me take this a step further because I'm afraid that they could throw this in on a test. Let me give you the scenario and then I'll get your question, Jacob. Let's go back to my open house scenario where I'm holding this house open. And 500 people come through. Josh is one of them. Josh never says anything confidential to me, so I never gave out a working with real estate agent's disclosure. And then as soon as I get done, I lock up the doors, I turn off all the lights, I've sealed up the open house, I've taken the open house signs down, and as I'm about to get in my car, Adriana shows up. She's like, oh my God, oh dang it, oh, I missed it, didn't I? Oh, I was really hoping to get to see this open house, and you've already shut down everything and closed it, haven't you? I knew I shouldn't have stopped at Starbucks on the way. I am so mad at myself, right? And I'm looking at her, and she's like, listen, is there any way you'd open it up and show me that house? Well, folks, it's no longer an open house anymore. So Adriana is an unrepresented buyer. Now, if I'm showing her a house, the North Carolina Real Estate Commission says if you're showing a one-off person a house, first substantial contact's happening. And so I need to explain to Adriana how this works so that she does not self-incriminate herself while we're walking around this house. Is everybody okay with that statement? An open house is kind of a blanketed, sure, I don't know if you're approved or not kind of thing. But for one specific showing, you call me and you want to see a house, I need to explain this to you. Everybody still with me?
Mm-hmm.
So, what you got, Jacob?
This is slightly off topic, but it's a question that popped into my head. If you are an agent and you yourself are looking for a home, can you represent yourself and collect the commission?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This is, obviously not testable in any way, shape, and form, but to answer your question, yes, typically most brokerage firms have a policy where you won't have to pay a split for up to 2 transactions per year, meaning if you sell your house and buy another house, you get to keep all of your commission because it's for your personal property. However, Jacob, I will tell you, and you probably won't remember this, number one, because of your sickness. Number two, by the time you get around to this, you'll probably forget it, but you can always ask me later. If you were to buy a house and you're entitled to a $12,000 commission, sure, you can take it. You just made $12,000. You owe Uncle Sam a portion of that. So the better thing to do as an agent representing yourself, don't take the $12,000. Ask the seller to give you a $6,000 reduction in purchase price and a $6,000 closing cost credit because now you haven't made any money. You don't pay taxes on it. You still got the $12,000 benefit.
That makes sense.
I've done that once or twice, So let me ask you a question and then we'll move into the working with the real estate agent's disclosure itself, all right? Take a look at these. Which of the following best describes first substantial contact?
Best describes it?
Yep.
B. I'm gonna go with C.
B?
C.
D.
D.
Folks, it's C. That word must is the only powerful word within that. Liking screen porches, that's great. I like Bugattis, I can't afford one. Seller states they are considering listing their home within the next 2 months. I'm considering getting in shape, but I've been saying that for 10 years, you know what I'm saying? Seller states they must relocate in 30 days. That's a time crunch, which could be used against somebody in a negotiation. Must is a powerful word. And then D states that buyer states that they prefer a 4-bedroom house. Yeah, I prefer to date models, but I'm not doing that either. You see what I'm saying? It's not strong enough. The only one that's absolute is must. Yeah. It's not enough to say, I like this color. I like somebody walks in and is like, oh, I love this Egyptian granite. Great. There's a lot of people who like pretty granite. It doesn't mean that you can use that against them in a negotiation. You got to look for the most powerful, the one that could be leveraged to hurt somebody. So let me introduce the working with the real estate agents disclosure, folks. And hopefully you're going to have an aha moment, because this piece of paper is going to articulate everything that I have taught you between yesterday and today. I promise it is. So it's all available in the, the textbook program, but sometimes I find it just easier to navigate here. So under publications, yet again, disclosure forms, working with real estate agents disclosure form. And so there is this 2-sided document. One side is for sellers, one side is for buyers. And I'm going to go through this. I'm going to point out some very important pieces. All right. So this is the seller side. This form is required for use in all sales transactions, including residential and commercial. There's important piece number 1. As I told you, it is not required if you're not buying or selling, potentially. Sales transactions. This form, go ahead, Dora.
Short question. Okay, something came up. What if, even though you haven't seen that in a long time, what if they're doing rent to own?
That's not going to be on the test. We'll just say that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not going to be on the test. The thing is, most rent-to-own scenarios don't involve real estate brokers. We may just get, some kind of referral fee or something for connecting the two parties. But because rent-to-owns typically go across a couple years, we would introduce the parties. We would advise them to talk to an attorney. That's not typically something that an agent is part of. And so, ergo, we wouldn't really be disclosing anything to those people. Yeah. I'm not going to say never, right? But, yeah, it's not going to be on the test, so don't get caught up on it. So here's a very important piece, okay? I told you that this never, ever, 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 ever creates a relationship that is so testable. If you do nothing, well, actually, there's a lot of very testable things tonight. So I need you to remember everything I've told you tonight and last night. I was going to say if you remember nothing else, but don't, I lied. You got to remember everything I taught you tonight and last night. Every night. Anyway, this form is not a contract. This is not forming a relationship. It is a disclosure. Hey, Slick, here's how this works. So this form is not a contract. Signing this disclosure only means you have received it. In a real estate sales transaction, it is important that you understand whether an agent represents you. Real estate agents are required to 1, review this form with you at first substantial contact before asking for or receiving your confidential information, and 2, give you a copy of the form after you sign it. This is for your own protection. Do not share any confidential information with a real estate agent or assume that the agent is acting on your behalf until you have entered into a written agreement with the agent to represent you. Otherwise, the agent can share your confidential information with others. Miranda rights. Remember when I said, if you're not with us, we're against you? There is this... Say what?
That also falls under when you said, if you're not our client, then you're just a customer like everybody else. So if we don't have anything signed with you for you to be our client, then you're a customer and we could talk about whatever.
Yeah. You start out as a customer before you become a client. So, you know, if you're not going to hire us, don't say anything. So kind of important, right? Now, this next piece right here. Check all relationship types below that may apply to the seller. Remember, this side is specifically for the seller. So what do I mean? Check all relationships types below that may apply to the seller. What does that mean?
Anything that's possible.
Anything that's possible. Translate that for me one more way, because you're right, but what does that mean?
So more than likely every box is going to be checked, but I don't know, is that the only two? Or is there more?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, here we go. There are 4 boxes.
Okay. Yeah, because it's possible that you could be in any of the 4 situations. You don't know yet.
Well, somebody might know. Let me help you out. Oh, Kirsten had an epiphany.
If they're an unrepresented seller.
Well, that is a possibility, but that could change, right? It could be that they start off that way. That could change. But even, let's just take this one out of the mix down here for the unrepresented seller. With these 3 boxes, how do we know which ones to check? Seller's agency, dual agency, designated. You don't need to read them yet. I'm going to explain them to you. But you've heard those terms already.
Would that be the ones the seller has agreed to?
They're not agreeing to anything yet. This is not an agreement. This is a menu.
So if you're a provisional broker and you're working under your BIC, I don't know.
Let me help you out. Whatever your firm offers, if your firm offers it, it could arise. Didn't I tell you that there are firms that only work with sellers?
Yes.
If you are a firm that only works with sellers, you're not going to check dual agency. You're not going to check designated, because dual agency can't arise in a firm that only works with sellers. So the only one that you would do is this one. But if your firm works with buyers and sellers and does dual agency and does designated agency, then you would check all of these, because they could all potentially arise based on your firm's structure, your firm's policies. Does that make sense? So here's where this is going to sound exactly like what I've been teaching you, folks. Let me zoom back in here. When it says seller agency, that means we're only caring about the seller. Here's what it says. The agent who gave you this form and the agent's firm must enter into a written listing agreement with you before they begin to market your property for sale. If you sign the listing agreement, the listing firm and its agents, all of them, would represent you. The buyer would either be represented by an agent affiliated with a different real estate firm or be unrepresented. So what I told you, right? If we're the seller's agent, the buyer may or may not be unrepresented, but either way, they're a customer to us, because they're either unrepresented or another firm represents them. But either way, they're a customer. You agree?
Right.
So then dual agency. Let's see if this sounds like what I taught you about dual agency. What did I tell you dual agency was? And you can use one of the quirky words I used.
The quirky words.
The quirky words. What did I call it?
Dual agency, you said, was worthless.
That's the word I was looking for. Worthless.
You said it's a bound, gag, no advice, worthless. That's what you said.
That is what I said. I'm going to hire you as a stenographer. You can take the notes. Bound and gagged and worthless. Now listen, Stephanie, remember when I made the joke about the speed dating? There's sometimes some freaks in the class, and when I say bound and gagged and worthless, a couple of people go, ooh. It's not that kind of bound and gagged, all right? Like, so some people get a little excited. They're like, ooh, sounds like a good Friday night. Not that kind, okay? Monica's like, damn. Right? Yeah, I've been teaching this way too long. I've seen all the reactions over all the things I've said over the years. I have a tendency to use the same jokes over and over again. So here's the thing, folks. I'm going to read this to you. You tell me if this sounds exactly like what I taught you about dual. Dual agency will occur if your listing firm has a buyer client who wants to purchase your property. If you agree in a written agency agreement, the real estate firm and any agent with the same firm, meaning the entire company, would be permitted to represent you and the buyer at the same time. A dual agent's loyalty would be divided between you and the buyer, but the firm and its agents must treat you and the buyer fairly and equally and cannot help you gain an advantage over the other party. Does that sound like what I just taught you?
What you said.
That's exactly what I said. It's almost like I know what I'm talking about. Say what?
I said that's what I have on my paper.
There you go.
I would hope you know what you're talking about.
Yeah, right. Listen, y'all can sleep a little better tonight knowing that y'all were being taught by the best, okay? So that's, yeah.
$500 to listen to you for 80 hours.
That's right. Yeah, I better know what I'm talking about, right? That's right. Exactly. Facts. Don't worry, you're in good hands. So now let's look at designated. Designated dual agency. If you agree in a written agency agreement, the real estate firm would represent both you and the buyer, but the firm would designate one agent to represent you and a different agent to represent the buyer. Each designated agent would be loyal only to their client, just like I told you. Now, the last one is an unrepresented seller. So this is something we would give you if we knew that we were not and would not be representing you. So if you were a buyer's agent communicating with a seller directly, not an agent, but a seller directly, you would hand them this as soon as you could, right? There's rules that state that if first substantial contact or the initial contact happens by the phone, yada, yada. So I'm going to get there in a second, but you would need to give this to the seller. And so here's what it says. Buyer agent working with an unrepresented seller, or a FSBO. The agent who gave you this form will not be representing you and has no loyalty to you. The agent will represent only the buyer. Do not share any confidential information with this agent. So if you are a buyer's agent assisting a buyer purchasing a for sale by owner, you would give this to the seller to disclose that you do not represent them and that they understand that you represent the buyer. Everybody okay?
Mm-hmm.
It's exactly like I explained it, isn't it? Well, let's see how sharp you are, folks. The other side is for buyers. Same thing right here. Form is required for use in all sales transactions, both residential and commercial. This form is not a contract. All of this is the same until this line right here. Something in this line is different than the seller side. Let's see how sharp you are. I know it's getting late. Let's see if y'all can find it.
I think the top one said that they can use it against you, and this one's saying that they can share it.
So that verbiage is the same.
No. Do you have entered into the agreement with the agent to represent?
I think if you don't have, it's saying that if you don't have an agreement, right, we by default represent the seller. So if you don't have if the buyer doesn't have an agreement.
No, they both require agreements.
I think it's the written agreement.
There you go, Eliza. Folks, the only difference is this lacks the word written. It just says into an agreement. On the seller side, it says written agreement. Why?
Because you can share that agreement verbally.
Because in North Carolina, you can start with an oral buyer agency agreement. And so that would be an agreement. It's not a written one, but it is an agreement. Ha 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 ha. There you go. Get on it. That was a good eye. That's to catch that at this time of night. That's pretty good. So look, the buyer agency, very similar, but of course deals with buyers. If you agree, The agent who gave you this form and the agent's firm would represent you as a buyer's agent and be loyal to you. You may begin with an oral agreement, but your agent must enter into a written buyer agency agreement with you before making a written offer or oral offer for you. The seller would either be represented by an agent affiliated with a different real estate firm or be unrepresented. So it does reference that oral agreement, having to reduce it to writing later. It talks about, how that's exclusive representation and then the seller is represented by somebody else. The dual and designated dual sections are the same. But now this one is for an unrepresented buyer. So in that scenario where you are acting as a seller subagent, the agent who gave you this form may assist you in your purchase, but will not be representing you and has no loyalty to you. The agent will represent the seller. Do not share any confidential information with this agent. Now, if you look at the bottom of these, there is places for signatures of the buyers, the sellers, and the agent. Now, folks, understand that this question could arise. Does a potential buyer or a potential seller have to sign this?
Yes, to acknowledge that they received.
I'm gonna say no.
Gonna
Only
say
just because
no.
I want to be difficult. What if I don't want to sign it? No, I don't want to sign it.
There you go. Folks, the thing is, you don't have a relationship with this person. How can you force anybody that you don't have a relationship with to sign anything? What are we going to do if they say, get the hell out of my face?
Get the hell out of their face.
That's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to get the hell out of their face. So understand that this disclosure is required. And we ask them to sign it. But if they refuse, it is what it is. What we would honestly do in the real world is we'd make a note. Ask Tim to sign it on this date and time. Tim refused to sign. You cannot force anybody to sign this agreement. So I just wanted you to know that, just in case the question comes up. So if they refuse to sign it, you could still enter into an agency agreement with them, as long as they sign that. But cool, that's...
Sign this, at which point you move on and find another client because you know that they're going to be a pain in the ass for the next couple months.
Well, it could be. I guess it depends. But, you're probably right. There's a 90% chance you're right on that, Jacob. So that is the working with real estate agents disclosure, okay? And it never, ever, 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 ever creates what?
An agreement.
An agreement. It never creates an agency relationship.
Not a contract.
Not a contract. It just says, here's the menu of options. And now that you realize it, it makes good sense. Because if you've ever gone to a restaurant and you sit down there and say, I'm sorry, I just want to let you know we're out of the ribeye tonight. You can't pick it later, can you? So it's the same thing with a firm. When the firm says we don't do dual agency, we don't do designated dual agency, we're not going to check the box. It's like telling you we're out of that, and you can't pick it later. It is just a menu. Here's the options. So what do you think happens after we have gone over this?
It's like, okay, what you want? Place your order.
Place your order. After we go over this and we review it, we say, now might I suggest some buyer agency? It's chef's kiss.
Absolutely divine.
Absolutely divine. Let me pair that with I'm going to get you the best deal, right? So you would have to form a relationship because remember, you can't work with anybody unless you represent them. And so this is disclosure, step 1, then forming a relationship, step 2. Once a relationship is formed, now you have somebody to represent and you can be in the transaction because you have to represent the buyer or the seller or both. Those are your only options. If you don't have a person in North Carolina, you're not in it because we do not have transactional brokerage. Everybody's still okay out there. Nobody's panicked. crying a little bit. Yeah, it's okay. I told you these are the big boy and big girl chapters, okay? They're the doozies. They were the first round of doozies. Just wait till we get to financing and contracts. But the first round of doozies. Corey shaking his head. I don't want to know about it, Seth. Don't you tell me. Don't you tell Seth, I don't want to know. Sorry, Corey. I have to teach it all to you. Got to learn it all. Aren't y'all just mad at HGTV, right? No. This is not what I thought this was. I thought I just got to show people pretty houses. They looked at 3, and then I just made a $15,000 commitment. That's not how this works? Somebody lied to y'all. What do you mean we have to know stuff? Now, rest assured that about 40% of the stuff I teach you, you will never use again in your lives. 60% will build on it, but 40% of it's just crazy crap. But
I've also been told here, and sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
I was gonna say I've also been told that in the new home construction side of things that on my brain, dude. I'm so sorry. I was told that since I'm in new home construction, I'm probably only gonna use or even think about like 5 or 10% of this.
Yeah, probably, because you're only dealing with like your specific product, and you just need to know the contracts and the way that flows, and so that's what you need to know inside and out. You don't have as many of these, as many things arising, but you may not stay in new construction forever, so then you'll kind of move into some of the other ones. So.
Oh yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I'm saying anymore. Please just the floor is yours, Seth.
It's all right, man. Hey, listen, I've been there. Imagine trying to teach the class feeling the way you feel. I've done it. Right? Just sitting there like sinus pressure and I'm just like, just trying to explain this stuff.
Where I'm at today, Seth, is it feels like there's an elephant stepping on my sinuses, and there's so much pressure in my sinuses that it's been pushing up against my tear duct, and my right eye has been watering all
day long. Yeah.
And I can't hear out of this ear right now.
I know exactly what you mean. And I hit it for you.
I need to see a doctor if you haven't seen one, but I swear by a neti pot.
That's what she told me whenever I was sick. Yeah.
That just feels like Chinese water torture. You're just waterboarding.
I'm with you. I don't think I could do it. I've never done one. I'm like, I don't really like the idea of.
No,
it moves it out though. It really does.
The after effect, it really does help, but the during process.
Yeah, it sounds terrible. I agree.
You're waterboarding yourself. It feels like you're vomiting through your nose.
Oh my god. Yeah.
Be a big boy, Jacob. Be a big boy.
No. Say what, Monica?
Get him his binky.
Oh, get him his binky. Hey, y'all don't come after Jacob, okay? I'm way older than him, and I wouldn't do it either. I'm a pass. Right. I'm a pass, man. Listen, call me what you want, all right? I turned the ripe old age of 16 today. That's my birthday. That's right. That's what I identify as.
Well, I got my rightful smack in the face of adulting yesterday when I went to the store and I bought tissues and cold medicine, and it cost $40 friggin'.
There you go. Life ain't cheap, man.
Welcome to life.
Yeah, life ain't cheap. You're not kidding. Just wait till you have 3 kids.
Cold medicine and 4 boxes of tissues. There's no reason that should be $40.
Yeah, no. It's all downhill from here, Jacob. Everything's more expensive.
I'm sorry, I have wildly derailed this class. Please.
It's all good. Everybody probably needed a little derailment after the torture that I just impressed upon their brains. In the time I have left, let me talk about what's on your slide here. We've already discussed this because of the way that I do the order. This is just kind of reiterating the nature of the brokerage businesses. In North Carolina, I've already kind of talked about the different verbiages we use. You get your license. Everybody in North Carolina is a broker, but you're on different statuses. So provisional broker is a status. Full broker, also called a non-provisional broker, is a status. And then the broker in charge is a separate status. You cannot stay as a provisional broker in North Carolina. It is impossible. at least to use your license. You can only stay as one actively for 18 months. After that, you have to be a full broker to continue on. But you're never required to go to broker in charge, but you would have to have a broker in charge to do those things we talked about the first week. Advertising, having a trust account, and affiliating other brokers. So this should all make some good sense to you. Every state uses a firm, a brokerage, a broker in some iteration. We just got to be very careful with the verbiage between national to the state portion. And we'll continue to talk more about that as time goes on. Let me ask you a question here in regard to some of the things we've been talking about. Sarah and John are visiting an open house in Hillsboro. The agent shows them every room in the house, talks at length about how good the schools are, and that a Harris Teeter is opening less than 2 miles away in 6 months. At no time does the agent discuss agency or the working with real estate agents disclosure. Is this a violation?
No.
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 No. Never had anything that would constitute first substantial contact. And that's how you're going to be tested, folks. Do not always give it to them. They're not testing you on that. That would be too easy if the answer to every test question was give it as soon as you meet somebody. It's not it. The answer is, what's the deadline? Did you break a law? Did you have to do it? That's what you're going to be tested on.
And I don't know how many people have started working on the midterm, but make sure when you do, make sure you're following and making sure you're looking at exact wording, because it's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's very frustrating.
Words matter.
I know this is the right answer, and I went back and I was like, Stephanie, what?
Words matter. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Folks, I'm not going to start it off because this is where we're going to pick up tomorrow, but I'm going to make a statement here about where we're going to pick up tomorrow because there's some very more important things to kind of delve into. I've mentioned this terminology, and this is a very important on the North Carolina portion of your exam. North Carolina is what we call a doctrine of caveat emptor state. That is a piece of verbiage which loosely translates or basically translates to let the buyer beware. Okay, I believe it's Latin. Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. This is basically a law that discusses the disclosures, or more appropriately, the lack thereof, between seller and buyer. In North Carolina, I told you, sellers do not have to disclose anything about their house to a buyer, or almost anything. I'll get into that more in just a second. So I'm going to make a few statements, and then of course I'll just open the floor for y'all to just talk to me for the last 10 minutes, as I have a tendency to do. So here's the statement. If a seller knows their roof leaks, they don't have to tell a buyer. If the seller knows they have $80,000 worth of foundation damage, they don't have to tell a buyer. If the seller knows there is a pit to hell in their basement, they don't have to tell the buyer. It does not matter how big, small, egregious, or otherwise. They do not have to disclose anything to the buyer. The only rules are they can't try to hide something and they can't commit fraud. There are zero obligations in North Carolina for a seller to disclose anything about their property to the buyer. I keep saying anything, but there's like 2 exceptions to that. But in general. What you got, Adriana?
Well, if they are asked about it.
They can say, I'm not telling you nothing.
Oh.
You ever watch Old School Chappelle Show? There's like one skit where he kept pleading the fifth. And it was really entertaining. If you don't know, pleading the fifth is the Fifth Amendment or whatever and of the Constitution. Or
right to remain silent.
There you go. Well, no, the right to not self-incriminate. The right to remain silent was the Miranda rights, but your brain's fuzzy. The right to not self-incriminate. And so, like, they were like asking him questions in this old school Dave Chappelle skit, and he's like, well, around this table of lawyers, and he's like, I plead the fifth. And he just kept going on. He's like, I plead the fifth. And he's like knocking on the table and everything. Folks, the seller has every right to plead the fifth. They ain't got to tell you nothing. So you can ask them all you want, and they're going to say, I plead the fifth. The fifth. Not telling you nothing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not going to tell you nothing. 5. Corey remembers it. And that's the best, Corey. That was the good stuff back in the day, right? Yeah, old school Dave Chappelle.
Classics.
Classics.
But that's why you get home inspections before you buy.
That's exactly right.
If there are issues, you can find out about them.
Yes. Correct. There are obligations on the brokers to discover and disclose material facts, and there are obligations or recommendations to have home inspections. And so in North Carolina, we have something on our contracts that kind of helps with this, but you have to understand that on a test question that, let's say, let me give you an example here. Justin knows that the seller's roof is leaking after the seller told him that it was. On the property disclosure provided by the seller said no representation in regard to a roof leak. And Justin failed to disclose this roof leak to any consumers. Who will be held liable in this case?
Well, both, but Justin especially.
Justin only. It's Justin only. The seller can say, I'm not telling you. No representation is I'm not telling you. And they are well within their legal rights to put that on a property disclosure in North Carolina. Justin, as an agent who knew it, has an obligation to discover and disclose all material facts. So Justin would be guilty of a willful omission. The seller is not held liable as long as he didn't try to cover it up. There you go. Folks, we're going to pick up here and just keep rocking and rolling. Everything's going to kind of, I'm going to say speed up a little bit at this point because, I mean, the agency is just like the really cumbersome piece. And you're going to have these reiterations of agency. After we get through a couple more concepts with agency, we're going to start talking about the actual specifics of the agency contracts, meaning the different types of listing agreements, the different types of buyer agency agreements, and things like that. And then we'll move, as I said, into basic contract law, specific North Carolina sales contracts. Then we'll move into the bigger, crazier things like financing and otherwise. So it's just going to keep rocking and rolling. And honestly, going to go faster now that your brains are kind of calibrated to the torture that we endure every single night. Not every night, but...